They told Dr. Robert Caldwell at 68 that he was too old to wear the uniform. The Army had age limits for a reason, the recruiter said. Combat zones were for young men with fresh knees and steady hands, not for senior citizens trying to relive glory days they never had. But at 0530 on a Tuesday morning at Forward Operating Base Sentinel in the Helmand province of Afghanistan, the old man was proving that age had nothing to do with refusing to quit. Specialist Caldwell ran the perimeter road alongside soldiers half his age, his breath coming in measured gasps that spoke of discipline earned over decades rather than the easy endurance of youth. His silver hair was cut high and tight, regulation perfect, and his lean 6'1" frame moved with the careful economy of someone who understood that wasting energy at 68 was a luxury he could not afford. The younger soldiers passed him easily, their laughter carrying on the cold morning air, but Caldwell kept his pace steady and his eyes forward. Sergeant Laura Reeves ran past him without slowing, her combat boots kicking up dust that settled on his uniform. She was 28 years old, dark-haired and dark-eyed, with the kind of controlled fury that came from losing someone you loved and never finding a place to put the grief. She glanced back at Caldwell as she pulled ahead, her voice carrying across the distance between them. "Keep up, old man, or request retirement. Nobody here needs a geriatric playing soldier." Caldwell did not respond. He had learned over 9 months at FOB Sentinel that words were wasted on people who had already decided what they believed. Sergeant Reeves hated him with a pure and simple hatred that required no justification beyond the fact that her brother was dead and Caldwell had been holding the scalpel when it happened. The truth was more complicated, but truth rarely mattered as much as people wanted to believe it did. He finished his 5 miles at exactly 06:15, his personal record here at Sentinel, in a full 12 minutes slower than his best time from 40 years ago. The young soldiers were already in the showers. Caldwell walked the last quarter mile to cool down properly, his surgeon's knowledge of muscle physiology telling him that shortcuts now would cost him mobility later, and he needed every advantage his aging body could provide. The mess tent was filling with soldiers when he arrived, their conversations a familiar blend of bravado and exhaustion. Caldwell took his tray of reconstituted eggs and coffee that tasted like diesel fuel, then found his usual corner table where he could eat alone. Isolation was easier than conversation, especially when most conversations began with some variation of the same question. "What's an old man like you doing in a combat zone?" The answer, like most true answers, was complicated enough that Caldwell had stopped trying to explain it. 4 years ago, Robert Caldwell had been chief of trauma surgery at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. He had spent 32 years building a reputation as one of the finest trauma surgeons in military medicine, a man whose hands could repair damage that other doctors declared impossible. He had trained over 200 residents, published 63 papers on battlefield surgical techniques, and received commendations from 3 different Secretary of Defense appointments for his innovations in treating combat injuries. He had also, according to the official record, killed Captain Daniel Reeves during what should have been a routine surgical repair of injuries sustained from an IED explosion in Kandahar province. The memory came to Caldwell now as he sat in the mess tent, unbidden and unwelcome as it always was. He could still see the operating room at Walter Reed with perfect clarity, the kind of detailed recall that trauma burned into a surgeon's mind and refused to fade no matter how much time passed. The bright surgical lights had turned everything into sharp shadows and brilliant highlights, the sterile white walls reflecting illumination that made every movement, every decision, every mistake visible with cruel precision. Captain Daniel Reeves had been 24 years old, a platoon leader with a wife named Jessica and a 6-month-old daughter named Emma that he had never met because deployment schedules and birth timing had conspired to keep him in Afghanistan through her first months of life. The IED had shredded his left leg below the knee, fractured his pelvis in 3 places, and caused internal bleeding from a liver laceration that was severe but, in Caldwell's experienced assessment, entirely survivable with proper surgical intervention. The initial surgery had gone well. Dr. Derek Hayes, then 31 years old and already being discussed as the future of Walter Reed's trauma department, had stabilized Reeves with the kind of confident efficiency that came from natural talent combined with 6 years of training under Caldwell's supervision. Hayes had controlled the bleeding, debrided the damaged tissue, and set the fractures with textbook precision. The patient had been moved to intensive care in stable condition, and everyone had expected a full recovery, followed by medical retirement and a return to his family. But 18 hours later, Reeves's blood pressure had dropped precipitously. Internal bleeding had resumed, likely from a vascular injury that had been missed during the initial surgery or had developed as a delayed complication. It happens sometimes, particularly with the kind of massive tissue trauma that IEDs caused. Hayes had been paged to the ICU, had examined the patient, and had made the call to return to the operating room for exploratory surgery. Caldwell had been at home when he received the notification. He had driven to Walter Reed through light traffic at 2 in the morning, arriving at the hospital to find Hayes already scrubbing in. As chief of trauma surgery, Caldwell supervised all complex cases, a policy he had instituted years ago after watching too many young surgeons make preventable mistakes when left to work without oversight. He had entered the operating room to find Hayes standing at the table, his surgical mask already in place, his gloved hands holding instruments with the familiar confidence that Caldwell had spent 6 years cultivating in his protege. The surgical team was assembled and ready. The patient was anesthetized and prepped. Everything appeared routine. Just another emergency surgery in a career that had included thousands of them. Then Hayes had leaned close to examine the surgical field, and Caldwell had smelled it. Whiskey. Just a faint scent cutting through the sharp antiseptic smell of the operating room, but unmistakable to someone who had spent 3 decades learning to read the subtle signs that separated competent surgeons from dangerous ones. Alcohol on a surgeon's breath at 2 in the morning meant one of two things. Either the surgeon had been drinking earlier and had not metabolized it fully, or the surgeon had been drinking recently enough that impairment was certain. Caldwell had frozen, his mind racing through options and obligations and the terrible mathematics of loyalty versus responsibility. He should have removed Hayes from the operating room immediately. Protocol demanded it. Patient safety required it. Every instinct built over 32 years of surgery screamed at him to take over the procedure himself and send Hayes home. But Hayes was more than just a protege. Hayes was the brilliant young surgeon that Caldwell had mentored through residency, had guided through countless difficult cases, had recommended for promotion and praised in evaluations, and treated like the son that Caldwell's own relationship with Nathan had never quite achieved. Hayes had been at Caldwell's house for dinners, had sought his advice on career decisions, had called him during moments of self-doubt, and received encouragement that had kept him in medicine when other paths might have been easier. And so Caldwell had hesitated. He had told himself that he would watch carefully, that his supervision would prevent any mistakes, that Hayes deserved the chance to prove that the faint smell of whiskey was imagination or coincidence or the residue of mouthwash rather than evidence of impairment. He had told himself that pulling Hayes out of surgery would destroy the younger doctor's career over what might be nothing more than paranoia. 32 years of experience had made Caldwell confident, perhaps too confident, in his ability to catch mistakes before they became fatal. He had supervised hundreds of surgeries by dozens of surgeons. He had intervened when necessary, had taught and corrected and prevented errors through vigilance and knowledge, and the kind of spatial awareness that came from spending half his life in operating rooms. He had genuinely believed that he could keep Captain Daniel Reeves safe even if Hayes was impaired, because Caldwell would be watching, and Caldwell always caught the mistakes before they killed patients. The surgery had proceeded with what appeared to be normal efficiency. Hayes had made the initial incision, had explored the abdominal cavity, had located the source of bleeding in a branch of the hepatic artery that had developed a delayed rupture. It was repairable, definitely survivable, the kind of vascular injury that experienced trauma surgeons handled routinely. Hayes had begun the repair, his hands moving with practiced precision, his voice calm as he called for instruments and gave instructions to the surgical team. Then, at 02:23 in the morning, Derek Hayes's alcohol-slowed reflexes had caused his hand to slip a fraction of an inch while dissecting near the femoral vessels. It was a tiny error, the kind of microscopic mistake that sober surgeons corrected automatically through muscle memory and spatial awareness built from thousands of hours of practice. But whiskey dulled those automatic corrections, and Hayes's scalpel had severed the femoral artery instead of the small vessel he had been targeting. Blood had fountained into the surgical field with the distinctive pulsing spray that meant major arterial damage. Hayes had frozen for perhaps 2 seconds, his whiskey-impaired brain struggling to process what had happened, And those 2 seconds had cost Captain Daniel Reeves any chance of survival. By the time Caldwell had seen what was happening and pushed Hayes aside to take over, by the time his own hands had clamped the artery and attempted the repair that might have saved the patient's life, Daniel Reeves was already bleeding out faster than even the most skilled surgeon could manage. Caldwell had worked with desperate efficiency, his hands moving through techniques he had performed hundreds of times, calling for blood transfusions and pressors and every intervention that might buy him the seconds he needed to repair the damage. But the femoral artery injury had been catastrophic, and Hayes's 2-second freeze had allowed blood loss that no amount of skill could overcome. The monitors had shown blood pressure dropping, heart rate climbing, and then the terrible flat line that meant cardiac arrest, despite everything Caldwell had tried. Reeves died at 02:37 in the morning, and by 03:15, Derek Hayes was in Caldwell's office, drunk and crying, begging Caldwell to protect him. "I'll lose everything," Hayes had said, his hands shaking as he gripped Caldwell's desk. "My career, my license, everything I've worked for. Please, Robert, you're the only father I've ever really had. Please." Caldwell had made his decision in the space of a single heartbeat, a decision that would cost him everything he had spent 3 decades building. He told Hayes to go home, to sober up, to say nothing. Then Caldwell spent the next 6 hours reviewing the surgical record and preparing his statement for the inquiry board. He told them the truth about the severed artery. He told them the truth about the failed attempts to repair the damage. He told them that the responsibility for the patient's death rested entirely with the supervising surgeon who had failed to properly oversee the procedure. The only thing he did not tell them was who had actually been holding the scalpel when the fatal error occurred. Dr. Robert Caldwell, Chief of Trauma Surgery at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, accepted full responsibility for the death of Captain Daniel Reeves. The inquiry board, faced with a respected surgeon's confession and a grieving family demanding accountability, had little choice but to accept his statement. Caldwell was offered the opportunity to retire quietly, rather than face formal malpractice proceedings. He accepted, submitted his resignation effective immediately, and walked out of Walter Reed at the age of 63 with his reputation destroyed and his conscience barely intact. His wife had left him 6 months later, unable to forgive him for throwing away their comfortable life for a mistake he refused to fully explain. His colleagues had distanced themselves, uncertain how to interact with a once respected surgeon now tainted by a patient death. Caldwell had spent 2 years alone in his townhouse in Alexandria, watching cable news and wondering if taking the blame for Derek Hayes had been nobility or cowardice. Then, on a morning 3 months after his 66th birthday, Caldwell had driven to the Army recruiting station in Arlington and asked if there was an age limit for enlisting. The recruiter, a staff sergeant who looked young enough to be Caldwell's grandson, had laughed until he realized the old man was serious. Then he had carefully explained that the maximum enlistment age was 35, that combat deployments were restricted to soldiers who met stringent physical requirements, and that the Army appreciated his interest, but perhaps he should consider volunteering at a VA hospital instead. Caldwell had left the recruiting station and made a phone call to the one person he thought might be able to help him. Colonel Vincent Reeves had been a captain 20 years ago when Caldwell had saved his life during the First Gulf War, removing shrapnel from around Reeves's spine in a field hospital with equipment that barely qualified as surgical instruments. Reeves had risen through the ranks to become a battalion commander, and he owed Caldwell a debt that 2 decades had not erased. The conversation had been brief. Caldwell told Reeves what he wanted. Reeves was silent for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried an emotion that Caldwell could not quite identify. "You know, my son Daniel died at Walter Reed 4 years ago. You know, the surgeon who killed him was never properly held accountable." Caldwell had expected this. "I know. The official record says you were supervising. That makes you responsible." "According to the official record, yes." Another long silence. Then, "I can get you enlisted. I can get you assigned to my battalion. But I want you to understand something, Robert. I'm not doing this as a favor. I'm doing this because I want to see what kind of man you really are. Whether you're the coward who hides behind rank and lets junior doctors take the fall, or whether you're the man who saved my life in '91. You'll come in as an E4 specialist. You'll be the oldest enlisted soldier in theater, and you'll do it at my FOB where I can watch you every single day." Caldwell had accepted the terms without hesitation, And 3 months later, he had shipped out to Afghanistan with a basic training waiver granted through channels that Colonel Reeves had navigated with the skill of a man who understood how to work the system when he needed to. That had been 9 months ago. 9 months of being the old man who could not keep up, the specialist who took orders from sergeants young enough to be his children, the former trauma surgeon who now dispensed ibuprofen and bandaged minor cuts, while being careful never to reveal that his hands had once performed surgeries that most doctors would not attempt even in fully equipped hospitals. Caldwell finished his breakfast and headed to the medical tent, the same route he walked every morning at 0645. FOB Sentinel was home to approximately 400 soldiers, a collection of temporary structures surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire in a valley that had seen fighting for longer than most of the soldiers stationed here had been alive. The medical facility was a reinforced tent with 6 hospital beds, a small pharmacy, and equipment that was adequate for treating routine injuries, but insufficient for anything requiring actual surgery. Captain Derek Hayes was already in the medical tent when Caldwell arrived, reviewing charts with the kind of casual confidence that came from never having to question whether he deserved his position. Hayes had been promoted to captain 2 years ago, around the same time he had requested assignment to a combat zone to add deployment experience to his service record. Colonel Reeves had personally approved the assignment, and if Hayes understood the irony of serving alongside the man who had taken the blame for his fatal mistake, he never showed it. Hayes looked up as Caldwell entered, his expression shifting through what Caldwell had learned to recognize as the standard sequence: acknowledgement, dismissal, and then a faint curl of contempt that suggested Hayes believed his former mentor had gotten exactly what he deserved. Specialist Caldwell, good of you to show up on time. We've got a logistics convoy coming back this afternoon that took small arms fire. Probable minor wounds, maybe some shrapnel. I'll handle the actual medical treatment. You can prep the beds and restock supplies. Caldwell nodded, said nothing, and moved to the supply cabinet. This was the routine they had established over 9 months. Hayes made decisions, Caldwell followed orders, and neither of them acknowledged that there had been a time when their positions had been reversed. Sergeant Laura Reeves entered the medical tent at 0700, her arrival announced by the sharp sound of her boots on the plywood floor. She was the FOB's senior medic, a position that gave her authority over Caldwell despite his decades of medical experience. And she exercised that authority with the kind of rigid precision that suggested she was afraid that any flexibility might be interpreted as weakness. Captain Hayes, Sergeant Reeves said, her tone respectful in a way it never was when she addressed Caldwell. I've got 3 soldiers reporting sick call this morning. Possible upper respiratory infections from the dust. Should I treat them, or do you want to examine them first? Hayes glanced at his watch. I've got a meeting with the colonel at 0800. You handle it. If anything looks complicated, get me afterward. Caldwell can assist you with basic tasks if you need an extra pair of hands. Reeves's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that Caldwell had learned meant she would prefer to work alone rather than accept help from him. But she nodded and gestured for Caldwell to follow her to the examination area. The 3 soldiers were young, probably none of them older than 22, and they all showed the same symptoms: persistent cough, mild fever, fatigue that went beyond normal deployment exhaustion. Caldwell watched as Sergeant Reeves examined each one, noting her technique with the automatic assessment of someone who had trained hundreds of medical students. She was competent, thorough, and careful to follow protocols exactly. But she missed the slight crackle in the second soldier's lungs that suggested his upper respiratory infection was progressing toward pneumonia. Caldwell cleared his throat quietly. Sergeant Reeves, if I could suggest— I didn't ask for suggestions, Specialist. Reeves cut him off without looking up from her examination. I've got this handled. Caldwell was quiet for a moment, watching the second soldier's respiratory rate, counting the breaths and noting the slight wheeze that Reeves had not caught. The soldier needed antibiotics, probably needed a chest x-ray if they had the equipment to do it properly, and definitely needed closer monitoring than a diagnosis of simple upper respiratory infection would provide. Sergeant, the second soldier may need— Did I ask you to speak, Specialist Caldwell? Reeves turned to face him now, her eyes hard. You're here to hand me supplies when I ask for them, not to practice medicine. You're a medic, not a doctor, and I don't care what your file might have said before you decided to play soldier at 68 years old. Is that clear? Crystal clear, Sergeant, Caldwell said quietly. He handed her the supplies she requested, watched her prescribe over-the-counter cough medication for all three soldiers, and said nothing when she dismissed them with instructions to return if symptoms worsened. The second soldier would be back within 48 hours with pneumonia that could have been prevented with proper treatment now. And Caldwell would watch it happen and do nothing because Sergeant Laura Reeves had made it clear that his medical opinion was worth less than nothing. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of routine humiliation. Hayes returned from his meeting and spent an hour teaching a class on combat medical protocols to a group of junior soldiers, presenting techniques that Caldwell had literally written the textbook on as if they were Hayes' own innovations. Reeves organized the medical supplies with aggressive efficiency, moving items that Caldwell had carefully arranged and replacing them in positions that made less sense, but allowed her to demonstrate her authority. Caldwell restocked bandages, cleaned equipment, and kept his mouth shut. He had learned that survival at FOB Sentinel required accepting that he was the old man who nobody trusted, the specialist who everybody outranked, the former surgeon who had killed a soldier and deserved whatever contempt came his way. At 1300 hours, Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell led his platoon through the FOB gates, returning from a patrol that had taken them through villages to the north where intelligence suggested Taliban movement, but evidence remained frustratingly absent. Nathan was 32 years old, lean and sunburned from 9 months in the Afghan sun, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw and a way of carrying himself that suggested he had learned early that showing weakness in front of soldiers who depended on you was a luxury that officers could not afford. He did not look at Caldwell as he passed the medical tent, did not acknowledge him in any way, and Caldwell had long since stopped expecting that he would. Their relationship had died by degrees over 3 decades of missed soccer games and forgotten birthdays and parent-teacher conferences that Caldwell had skipped because surgery schedules did not accommodate family life. The final break had come 5 years ago when Sarah Caldwell had been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. Nathan had begged his father to take leave to spend Sarah's final months with her instead of in operating rooms. Caldwell had meant to, but then Captain Daniel Reeves had arrived at Walter Reed with catastrophic injuries, and Caldwell had postponed his leave by 1 day. Then Derek Hayes had made his fatal mistake, and Caldwell had spent the next week dealing with the inquiries and investigations. By the time he had resolved to take his leave regardless, Sarah had slipped into unconsciousness. She died 3 days later, and Nathan had been holding her hand while Robert Caldwell had been in his office writing the statement that would destroy his career. Nathan had not attended his father's retirement ceremony. He had not called when Caldwell enlisted at 66. He had not responded when Caldwell tried to explain that serving at FOB Sentinel was not running away, but running towards something that might balance the scales for his failures. Now, watching his son organize his platoon in the dusty FOB courtyard, Caldwell felt the familiar weight of failures that could not be fixed with surgical skill or medical knowledge or any of the expertise he had spent 3 decades acquiring. He had saved hundreds of lives in operating rooms, but he had not saved his marriage, had not saved his relationship with his son, had not even been present when his wife had needed him in those final days. One of Nathan's soldiers approached the medical tent, a young private who could not have been more than 19, his face pale beneath his tan. The private's gait was careful, favoring his left leg in a way that suggested significant injury being concealed. "Sir," the private said to Captain Hayes, "reporting for sick call, twisted my ankle on patrol this morning." Hayes glanced up with minimal attention. "Let Sergeant Reeves take a look at it. Caldwell, assist her." Laura Reeves was occupied with another patient, so Caldwell gestured for the young soldier to sit. The private unlaced his boot with movements that were too careful, and when he removed it, Caldwell saw significant swelling, discoloration, and an angle to the foot that indicated possible fracture. Caldwell began a gentle examination, his hands moving with automatic precision, feeling for bone fragments. The private winced when Caldwell's fingers found the fracture line in one of the metatarsal bones, a subtle break that Caldwell's decades of experience identified immediately through touch alone. "Private," Caldwell said quietly, "this is more than a twisted ankle. You have a fracture that needs Specialist Caldwell." Laura Reeves' voice cut across his words. "Step away from my patient." Caldwell withdrew and watched as Sergeant Reeves performed her own examination with competent but less experienced technique. She palpated the injury, noted the swelling, and reached the wrong conclusion. "Looks like a bad sprain," Reeves always said. "I'll wrap it, give you anti-inflammatories. Stay off it for 48 hours. The private nodded and Reeves wrapped the injured foot, dispensed ibuprofen, and sent him back to barracks with instructions that would allow a fractured bone to bear weight when it should be immobilized. Caldwell said nothing. The private would be back within a day or two when the pain became unbearable, and it would be another small failure in the accounting of failures that Caldwell carried. The afternoon wore on with familiar minor complaints and routine treatments. Soldiers arrived reporting headaches, minor cuts, muscle strains. Captain Hayes treated them with efficient competence, never making significant errors but never demonstrating deeper diagnostic insight. Sergeant Reeves assisted with rigid adherence to protocols, adequate for routine cases but insufficient for anything complex. Caldwell handed them supplies, restocked shelves, cleaned equipment, and watched soldiers receive treatment that was good enough most of the time but not always. At 1600 hours, Nathan entered the medical tent to deliver a brief report about his patrol. Hayes listened, made notes, then noticed Nathan glancing toward where Caldwell was organizing supplies. "Your father's been useful today," Hayes said, his tone carrying false courtesy. "Handed me supplies without dropping anything." Nathan's jaw tightened. "He's not my father. He's Specialist Caldwell. Just another soldier." Hayes smiled, enjoying the discomfort. "Right. Just another soldier who happens to be old enough to be everyone's grandfather." Nathan left without responding, and Caldwell continued his work with steady hands despite the familiar ache of rejection. At 1700 hours, Caldwell was cleaning medical equipment when Colonel Vincent Reeves entered the tent. Reeves was 58 years old, a career infantry officer who wore his rank with the kind of quiet authority that came from leading men in actual combat rather than just training exercises. He moved with a slight limp from the shrapnel wound Caldwell had repaired 20 years ago, and his eyes carried the particular weariness of a man who had lost a son and never quite figured out how to fill the space that loss had left. "Specialist Caldwell," Reeves said, his voice carrying the formal tone he always used when others might be listening. "I need to see you in my office at 1800 hours." "Yes, sir," Caldwell replied, keeping his own voice equally formal. Reeves left without further comment, and Captain Hayes glanced up from his paperwork with an expression that suggested he was wondering what kind of trouble the old man had gotten himself into now. Caldwell finished cleaning the equipment, restocked the last of the supplies, and walked across the FOB to the command building as the Afghan sun began its descent toward the mountains. Colonel Reeves's office was a small space with plywood walls, a metal desk, and a map of Helmand Province covered with tactical markings that told the story of a long deployment filled with more frustration than victory. Reeves was standing at the map when Caldwell entered, his back to the door, and for a long moment neither man spoke. "Close the door, Specialist." Caldwell closed it and stood at parade rest, waiting. He had learned over 9 months that Reeves measured time differently than most officers, that the colonel believed silence could be its own form of communication. Finally, Reeves turned to face him. "Do you know what day it is, Robert?" "Tuesday, sir, November 14th. 4 years ago today, my son Daniel died on an operating table at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. 4 years ago today, I was told that the supervising surgeon had made critical errors in judgment that resulted in my boy bleeding to death. 4 years ago today, I started hating Dr. Robert Caldwell for taking my son away from me." Caldwell said nothing. There was nothing to say. Reeves moved to his desk and picked up a file folder. "For 4 years, I believed what the official record told me, that you were the surgeon responsible, that your declining skills had caused my son's death, that you had accepted retirement rather than face a formal malpractice board because you knew you were guilty." He opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "Then 6 months ago, I started asking questions, quiet questions through channels that don't leave official records. I wanted to understand how a surgeon with your reputation could make the kind of mistakes that killed Daniel. And the more I asked, the less the official story made sense." Reeves spread the documents on his desk. Medical supply records that showed Dr. Derek Hayes requesting surgical instruments at 0100 hours the night Daniel died, a time when he had no scheduled procedures. Security footage from the hospital parking lot showing Hayes's car arriving at 0130, his walk unsteady. Blood alcohol tests from the hospital's random screening program that Hayes had somehow avoided that week despite protocols requiring them. "I know the truth now, Robert. I know that Derek Hayes killed my son. I know that Hayes was drunk when he operated. I know that you tried to save Daniel after Hayes made the fatal error. And I know that you took the blame to protect Hayes." Caldwell remained at parade rest, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Reeves's shoulder. The evidence was more thorough than he had expected, but Reeves had always been a man who did not stop until he had answers. "Why?" Reeves asked, and his voice carried something that might have been pain, or might have been anger, or might have been both. "Why did you destroy your career for a man who killed my son?" Caldwell was quiet for a long time, choosing his words carefully. "Hayes was my responsibility, sir. I trained him. I supervised him. I should have caught the signs that he was struggling. I should have removed him from that operating room. When I failed to do those things, Daniel died. The official record is accurate in the ways that matter. I was the supervising surgeon. I was responsible." "That's not an answer. That's an excuse." "It's the only answer I have, sir." Reeves stared at him, and Caldwell could see the colonel working through emotions that had no easy resolution. The loss of a son created a grief that demanded accountability, but learning that the accountability had been placed on the wrong person created new questions that were somehow worse than simple anger. "I arranged for your enlistment," Reeves said finally. "I got you assigned here to FOB Sentinel. I watched you run with soldiers half your age. I watched you take orders from my daughter, who hates you for something you didn't do. I watched you accept abuse from Derek Hayes, who owes you everything and treats you like nothing. Do you know why I did that?" Caldwell met his eyes. "No, sir. Because I needed to know what kind of man you are. Whether you're someone who sacrifices himself to protect others, even when they don't deserve it, or whether you're a coward who hides behind noble gestures to avoid real accountability." Reeves moved around the desk to stand directly in front of Caldwell. "For 9 months I've tested you. I've put you in positions where you could have revealed your skills, where you could have proven that you're more than just a specialist with basic medical training. I've watched you let soldiers suffer because following the chain of command was more important than showing what you can really do. I've watched you take punishment for mistakes you didn't make, again and again and again. What did you conclude, sir? That you're either the most noble man I've ever met or the most broken. Maybe both." Reeves returned to his desk and sat down heavily. "Tomorrow morning, intelligence indicates we're going to be hit. A major coordinated attack targeting this FOB. Estimated 200 casualties, maybe more. Our medical facilities are inadequate for that kind of mass casualty event. Captain Hayes is a competent doctor, but he's never handled anything on this scale. Sergeant Reeves is a good medic, but she's never done triage for a disaster scenario." Caldwell felt something cold settle in his chest. "Sir, I'm not ordering you to reveal yourself, Robert. I'm not ordering you to use skills that officially don't exist. But I am telling you that tomorrow, 200 soldiers might be bleeding. And the difference between life and death for some of them might be whether an old man who used to be the chief of trauma surgery at Walter Reed decides that hiding his skills matters more than saving lives." The silence between them was heavy with implications that both men understood perfectly. "What happens if I do reveal myself, sir? Then everyone will know that you've been lying for 9 months. Everyone will know that you let soldiers suffer when you could have helped them. Everyone will know that Specialist Caldwell is really Dr. Robert Caldwell, and all the questions that raises will have to be answered. And if I don't, then soldiers who could have been saved will die, and you'll have to live with that the way you've lived with everything else." Reeves stood and moved to the door, opening it in a clear dismissal. "There's one more thing you should know, Robert. My daughter Laura doesn't know the truth about who killed her brother. She still believes you are responsible. When this attack comes, when casualties start piling up, she's going to be looking to you for help, whether she wants to or not. Are you going to let her down the way you think you let my son down? Or are you going to be the surgeon who saves lives when it matters most?" Caldwell walked out of the office without answering, because both of them already knew there was only one answer he could give. He had spent 4 years hiding, 4 years accepting blame for mistakes he had not made, 4 years pretending to be less than he was because he believed that was the punishment he deserved for failing to stop Derek Hayes. But tomorrow, if Colonel Reeves's intelligence was accurate, 200 soldiers would be bleeding, and the only surgeon within 50 miles who could save them would be a 68-year-old specialist who everyone believed was too old to serve. Robert Caldwell walked back to his quarters through the gathering darkness of the Afghan evening, and for the first time in 4 years, he allowed himself to think about what it would mean to stop hiding, to use his hands for surgery again, to make life and death decisions with the weight of 200 casualties, depending on whether an old man's skills were still good enough to matter. His quarters were a plywood structure divided into 4 sleeping areas, each barely large enough for a narrow bunk and a wall locker. Caldwell shared this space with three other enlisted soldiers, all of them in their 20s, all of them treating him with the particular form of distant courtesy that younger people reserve for older individuals who they could not quite figure out how to categorize. Specialist Martinez was cleaning his rifle when Caldwell entered, the distinctive smell of gun oil filling the small space. Martinez was 23 from El Paso and had once mentioned that his grandfather had served in the Gulf War, which seemed to create some kind of generational bridge that made him slightly less uncomfortable around Caldwell than the other soldiers were. Evening Specialist Martinez said, "Word is we might get hit tomorrow. Big one. You hear anything in the medical tent?" Caldwell moved to his bunk and began preparing his gear. "Just rumors, same as everyone else. But you should make sure your individual first aid kit is fully stocked. Check your tourniquets. Make sure your quick clot packages are not expired." Martinez nodded, accepting the advice because it came from a medic rather than because it came from Caldwell specifically. The other two soldiers in the quarters, Specialist Chen and Williams, arrived together from evening chow, their conversation dying as they entered and saw Caldwell. The dynamic shifted immediately, the easy camaraderie between the younger soldiers becoming more formal and constrained. Caldwell understood the reasons. He was older than their fathers, old enough that his presence in an enlisted barracks felt like a category error that nobody quite knew how to address. Most difficult of all, he was a living reminder that age could claim anyone, that the invincibility they felt at 23 would eventually give way to the kind of fragility that made a 68-year-old man struggling to keep up on morning runs seem less like an inspiration and more like a warning. Caldwell finished preparing his gear and lay on his bunk, staring at the plywood ceiling where someone had scratched a countdown to their deployment end date. The other soldiers settled into their evening routines, their conversations carefully excluding him not from malice, but from simple awkwardness. Sleep did not come, but Caldwell had not expected it would. He had not slept well for 4 years, not since Captain Daniel Reeves had died and Caldwell had made the choice that would cost him everything. The insomnia had become familiar, almost comfortable in its consistency. He thought about Colonel Reeves's question, the one that had not been spoken directly, but had hung in the air between them. When 200 soldiers are bleeding tomorrow, will you hide behind protocols and rank? Or will you be the surgeon who saves lives when it matters most? The answer should have been simple. Caldwell had not spent 32 years in surgery for prestige or money. He had done it because saving lives was the only thing that had ever made sense to him. When he was in an operating room with a patient bleeding, nothing else mattered except the next decision, the next movement, the next technique that might mean the difference between life and death. But 4 years of hiding had changed something in him. 4 years of accepting blame for mistakes he had not made, of watching his reputation destroyed, of losing his career and his marriage and his relationship with his son, had created a caution that felt like wisdom, but might actually be cowardice. Colonel Reeves had forced him to confront a harder question. Had protecting Hayes been nobility, or had it been the easier choice? Had Caldwell taken the blame because he genuinely believed it was right, or because accepting personal destruction was somehow less frightening than fighting to expose the truth? If he revealed himself tomorrow, everyone would know that he had been hiding his skills for 9 months. Everyone would ask why he had let soldiers suffer when he could have helped them. Everyone would wonder what kind of man pretended to be less than he was while other people paid the price. And Caldwell would have to explain that he had believed he deserved to be punished, that he had thought hiding his skills was appropriate penance for failing to stop Derek Hayes. The explanations would sound weak, self-serving rationalizations for decisions that had allowed preventable suffering. But if he did not reveal himself, if he maintained his cover while 200 soldiers bled from injuries that his surgical expertise could address, then he would be choosing safety over service. He would be proving that 4 years of hiding had turned him into exactly what everyone believed. Just an old man, too broken and too scared to be the surgeon he used to be. The temperature dropped as night settled over Forward Sentinel. Caldwell pulled his blanket higher and listened to the sounds of the FOB at night, generators humming, sentries calling challenges, and somewhere in the distance, soldiers laughing at something that was probably not actually funny, but became so through shared deployment experience. Martinez finished cleaning his rifle and began checking his first aid kit, following Caldwell's advice with methodical care. Chen and Williams played cards at the folding table, their game accompanied by good-natured insults. Caldwell closed his eyes and tried to summon the memory of surgery, of standing at an operating table with a patient's life depending on the steadiness of his hands. He flexed his fingers, feeling for tremors that might indicate age-related decline. His hands were steady as they had been 20 years ago, perhaps steadier because 68 years of living had taught him that panic helped nothing and patience solved problems that speed could not. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions he had been avoiding for 4 years. Tomorrow would reveal whether being too old to serve was truth or just another form of prejudice, whether 68 years of living had taught him anything worth knowing, whether hiding behind guilt and shame had been penance or just another form of cowardice. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions he had been avoiding. Tomorrow would reveal whether being too old to serve was truth or just another form of prejudice. Tomorrow would test whether 68 years of living had taught him anything worth knowing. Tomorrow, Robert Caldwell would find out if the ghost of the surgeon he used to be could save 200 soldiers from dying, or if 4 years of hiding had turned him into exactly what everyone believed he was. Just an old man playing medic in a war that had no use for his outdated skills. The night passed slowly, and Caldwell waited for dawn with the steady patience of someone who had learned that some tests could not be avoided, only endured. The explosion that changed everything came at 0647 hours on a Wednesday morning. 3 minutes after sunrise painted the Afghan mountains in shades of amber and gold that would have been beautiful if anyone at Forward Operating Base Sentinel had been looking at the sky instead of preparing for another day of surviving in a place where survival was never guaranteed. Robert Caldwell was in the medical tent performing the routine he had followed for 9 months, checking supplies that Sergeant Laura Reeves had already checked, organizing equipment that was already organized, occupying himself with small tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied enough to avoid thinking about Colonel Vincent Reeves's question from the night before. When 200 soldiers are bleeding, will you hide or will you save them? The first explosion answered that question with the finality of physics. A massive vehicle-borne improvised explosive device detonating at the main gate with enough force to shake the ground beneath Caldwell's feet and blow out the medical tent's windows in a shower of glass that turned morning sunlight into 1,000 falling shards. Caldwell's surgical reflexes took over before his conscious mind processed what was happening, his body dropping to the floor beneath the window line, while his hands protected his head and his brain began the automatic calculation of blast radius and probable casualties. The second explosion came 8 seconds later, a secondary device planted near the main barracks that had been designed to catch soldiers as they evacuated from the first blast. Caldwell heard the distinctive crump of high explosives, followed by the terrible sound of a building collapsing, concrete and steel failing under forces they had never been engineered to withstand, and then the screaming started. Medic, medic, medic. The calls came from every direction at once. Dozens of voices crying out for help in tones that ranged from controlled urgency to animal panic, and Caldwell was moving before the third explosion hit, grabbing his medical bag and running toward the sounds of men dying, while overhead the base alarm began its delayed wail of warning about an attack that had already succeeded beyond any enemy planner's most optimistic projections. The third explosion caught the ammunition storage bunker, a catastrophic chain reaction that sent ordnance cooking off in sequential detonations that turned FOB Sentinel's southern perimeter into a killing zone where shrapnel from American bullets and rockets tore through American soldiers who had survived the first 2 blasts only to be killed by their own weapons. Caldwell ran through smoke that turned the morning sun into an orange haze, his 68-year-old lungs burning with exertion and his mind automatically triaging casualties based on the sounds they were making. The soldiers who were screaming were alive enough to scream. The ones who needed him first were the ones who were too badly hurt to make noise. What Caldwell found when he reached the collapsed barracks was carnage that exceeded anything he had seen in 32 years of trauma surgery, and that included field hospitals during the first Gulf War, where mass casualty events had been measured in dozens rather than hundreds. The main barracks had housed approximately 160 soldiers when the secondary device had detonated, and the building's collapse had created a disaster scene that looked like photographs from earthquake zones or terrorist attacks. A jumbled landscape of broken concrete and twisted steel with human bodies buried beneath rubble that would require heavy equipment to move. Except they did not have time for heavy equipment. because soldiers trapped under tons of debris were bleeding to death while Caldwell stood there, trying to comprehend the scope of what had just happened. Soldiers were already digging through the rubble with their bare hands, pulling at concrete chunks and steel beams with the kind of desperate strength that came from knowing their friends were dying underneath. Caldwell saw Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell coordinating rescue efforts near the western edge of the collapse, his son's voice carrying across the chaos with the controlled urgency of an officer who was maintaining composure through force of will alone. "We need leverage here. Get me a pry bar and 3 more men. Smith, check for survivors in that air pocket. Move, move, move." Caldwell ran toward the nearest visible casualty, a young soldier who had been thrown clear of the collapse and now lay motionless in the dust with his left leg bent at an angle that meant compound fractures and probable arterial damage. The soldier's eyes were open but unfocused, shock already setting in, and Caldwell's hands moved with automatic precision to assess injuries that were severe but survivable with immediate intervention. Tourniquet above the knee, pressure on the arterial bleed, check for other injuries, establish IV access, monitor for internal bleeding. The medical protocols flowed through Caldwell's mind with the ease of muscle memory. 32 years of training compressed into actions that took less than 90 seconds to destabilize a soldier who would have bled out in 5 minutes without treatment. Specialist Caldwell. Captain Derek Hayes appeared beside him, the younger doctor's face pale beneath a coating of dust and his hands already shaking in a way that Caldwell recognized as the first stage of psychological overload. Hayes had been in the medical tent when the explosions hit, had emerged to find a mass casualty situation that exceeded anything his training or experience had prepared him to handle, and the gap between his confident, peacetime competence and the reality of 200 soldiers needing immediate medical care was visible in the tremor of his fingers and the slight dilation of his pupils that meant his sympathetic nervous system was flooding his body with adrenaline faster than his conscious mind could process. "Caldwell, I need you to start triage." Hayes's voice cracked slightly on the word triage, and he swallowed hard before continuing. "We've got casualties everywhere. I need you to tag them. Green for walking wounded, yellow for urgent, red for immediate, black for expectant. Do you understand?" Caldwell understood, and what he understood was that Captain Derek Hayes was about to make decisions that would kill soldiers who could have been saved, because Hayes had been trained in peacetime protocols that assumed adequate resources and time that did not exist when 200 men were bleeding simultaneously. "Sir," Caldwell said, carefully, "mass casualty triage requires reverse triage. We treat the most salvageable first, not the most urgent." Hayes's expression tightened. "I know the protocols, specialist. Just do what I told you." But the protocols Hayes knew were wrong for this situation, and Caldwell could already see the younger doctor making the kind of mistakes that would seem logical to someone who had never dealt with battlefield medicine on this scale. Hayes was triaging based on injury severity rather than survival probability, prioritizing soldiers with the worst visible wounds instead of identifying the cases where immediate intervention would make the difference between life and death. Caldwell watched Hayes examine a soldier with horrific burns covering 60% of his body, injuries that would require specialized treatment in a burn unit that was not going to arrive at FOB Sentinel for hours even under the best circumstances, and tag him as red for immediate treatment. Then Hayes moved past a soldier with a sucking chest wound that was eminently fixable with a chest tube and proper respiratory support, tagging him as yellow for urgent but not immediate care. The soldier with the burns would die regardless of what anyone did in the next hour. The soldier with the chest wound would die in 20 minutes without intervention, but would survive with simple treatment that any competent medic could provide. Hayes had just sentenced the survivable patient to death while allocating resources to a patient who was already beyond saving. Caldwell opened his mouth to object, to explain that battlefield triage operated on different mathematics than hospital emergency rooms. But Hayes was already moving toward the next casualty, and Sergeant Laura Reeves was running toward them with her own medical bag and an expression that suggested she was maintaining control through sheer determination alone. "Captain Hayes," Reeves said, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them, "we're getting reports of at least 200 casualties. The medevac helicopters are grounded because of possible anti-aircraft threats. We're on our own until the birds can fly." Hayes absorbed this information, and Caldwell saw something shift in the younger doctor's eyes. A flicker of panic quickly suppressed but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. 200 casualties with no evacuation capability meant FOB Sentinel's medical facilities would have to handle injuries that should have been treated at field hospitals or even at Bagram, and the gap between should and reality was where soldiers died. Okay, Hayes said, and his hands were shaking harder now. Okay, we set up the medical tent as our primary treatment facility. Reeves, you handle minor wounds. Caldwell, you continue triage and bring me the red tags. I'll do emergency stabilization on the critical cases. It was the wrong plan executed by the wrong personnel, making the wrong decisions. And Caldwell knew with the certainty of 3 decades in trauma medicine that soldiers were going to die because of it. But he was Specialist Caldwell, a 68-year-old enlisted medic who took orders from Captain Hayes whether those orders made sense or not. And so he nodded and moved toward the next casualty while his mind calculated the cost of obedience. The next 2 hours were a descent into the kind of organized chaos that revealed who people really were when the systems they relied on failed completely. Caldwell moved through the disaster zone performing triage on soldiers with injuries that ranged from minor shrapnel wounds to trauma so severe that death was inevitable, and he tagged them according to Hayes's protocols while knowing that those protocols were killing men who could have been saved. A young private with bilateral femur fractures and hypovolemic shock got tagged black for expectant because Hayes had decided that soldiers who could not walk were too resource-intensive to treat when so many others needed care. Caldwell knew from experience that the private's injuries were survivable with aggressive fluid resuscitation and proper splinting, that the soldier would live if someone just took 30 minutes to stabilize him properly. But Hayes's decision meant the private would be given morphine for pain and left to die while medical resources went to soldiers with more dramatic but less critical injuries. Caldwell placed the black tag on the private's uniform and moved to the next casualty, and a small piece of his soul died with that decision. A staff sergeant with a penetrating abdominal wound that was causing internal bleeding got tagged yellow for urgent rather than red for immediate because the bleeding was not visible externally, and Hayes had not recognized the signs of intra-abdominal hemorrhage. Caldwell knew the sergeant had maybe 40 minutes before blood loss caused irreversible shock. That immediate surgical intervention could save him, but Hayes had walked past without understanding the urgency. Caldwell adjusted the sergeant's positioning to slow the bleeding and moved to the next casualty, and another piece of his soul followed the first into whatever darkness existed for the parts of people that died while their bodies kept breathing. By 0900 hours, 90 minutes after the attack began, the casualty count had stabilized at 217 soldiers wounded with 43 confirmed dead, and Captain Derek Hayes was performing emergency medicine in the medical tent with the kind of barely controlled panic that came from being overwhelmed by responsibilities he could not fulfill. Caldwell watched from the triage area as Hayes attempted to intubate a soldier with severe facial trauma, the younger doctor shaking hands, missing the placement 3 times before finally securing an airway that should have taken 30 seconds to establish. Hayes moved to the next patient, a soldier with crush injuries from the barracks collapse, and began treating for shock without recognizing that the patient's distended abdomen and absent bowel sounds indicated internal bleeding that would kill him within the hour without surgical intervention. Hayes administered IV fluids and pressors, standard protocol for shock, while missing the actual cause of the patient's deteriorating condition. Caldwell could not watch anymore. He approached Hayes with the careful deference of an enlisted soldier addressing an officer, his voice pitched low to avoid being overheard by the other soldiers in the medical tent. "Sir, that patient has signs of intra-abdominal bleeding. He needs exploratory surgery or he will not survive." Hayes looked at him with eyes that were dilated too wide and hands that continued their tremor. "Caldwell, I appreciate your input, but I am the doctor here. I know what I am doing." Except Hayes clearly did not know what he was doing, and soldiers were dying because of it. The patient with the intra-abdominal bleeding died 17 minutes later, and Caldwell had to stand there and watch it happen while knowing that 30 minutes of surgery could have saved him. By 1100 hours, the death toll had risen to 53, and Caldwell's careful count told him that at least 12 of those deaths had been preventable with proper medical care. 12 soldiers who had survived the explosions only to die from treatable injuries because Captain Derek Hayes was overwhelmed and making mistakes that a first-year resident should have caught. Sergeant Laura Reeves was working with desperate efficiency to treat minor wounds, her hands steady and her voice calm as she reassured soldiers who were terrified and in pain. But even she could see that Hayes was failing. She approached Caldwell during a brief lull, her expression tight with controlled fury. Specialist, she said quietly, your file says you have some additional medical training beyond basic combat medic certification. Captain Hayes is making mistakes. Soldiers are dying. If you have knowledge that could help, now would be the time to use it. Caldwell looked at her, this young woman who hated him for something he had not done, who blamed him for her brother's death and treated him with contempt that he had accepted as deserved punishment. She was asking him to reveal himself, to use skills that would expose 4 years of deception, to step outside the role he had carefully maintained. I am just a medic, Sergeant. I follow doctor's orders. Laura Reeves stared at him with an expression that suggested she was evaluating whether he was a coward or a fool or something worse. Then you are killing them just as surely as Hayes is, she said, and walked away to treat another soldier, while Caldwell stood there carrying the weight of an accusation that was absolutely correct. The breaking point came at 1200 hours, when Master Sergeant Cole Martinez emerged from the collapsed barracks, carrying Colonel Vincent Reeves, the FOB commander who had orchestrated Caldwell's enlistment and spent 9 months testing whether the old doctor was a man of honor or a broken coward hiding behind noble gestures. Reeves was unconscious, his uniform soaked with blood, and Martinez was calling for medical assistance with the kind of controlled urgency that meant the situation was critical. We need a doctor here now. The colonel is hurt bad. Captain Hayes ran toward them, Caldwell following because protocol demanded it, and what they found when they examined Colonel Reeves was a trauma surgeon's nightmare. Reeves had been trapped under a collapsed steel beam, and the crush injuries to his pelvis and abdomen suggested massive internal bleeding, along with probable organ damage that would require immediate surgical intervention to have any chance of survival. Hayes performed a rapid assessment, his hands moving over Reeves's body with the automatic motions of medical training while his face grew progressively paler. Caldwell could see what the younger doctor was seeing, a patient with injuries so severe that treatment would require resources and time that did not exist when 90 other casualties still needed care. A battalion commander whose rank demanded maximum effort, but whose injuries suggested that effort would be futile. Hayes made his decision with the terrible logic of mass casualty triage. He is expectant, Hayes said, his voice flat with the kind of emotional shutdown that came from making decisions that violated every instinct that had led someone into medicine. We cannot allocate resources to a patient this critical when we have so many others who need care. Make him comfortable. Morphine for pain. That is all we can do. Sergeant Laura Reeves had followed them, and when she heard Hayes' assessment, her composure finally shattered. That is my father, she said, her voice rising towards something that might become a scream if she let it. You are not giving up on him. You are going to save him. Hayes looked at her with something that it might have been compassion if it had not been buried under exhaustion and overwhelm. Sergeant, I am sorry, but your father's injuries are beyond what we can treat here. Even at a fully equipped hospital, his survival would be questionable. We have to focus on the soldiers we can save. Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell appeared then, having heard the commotion, and when he saw Colonel Reeves lying in the dust, bleeding and tagged as expectant, something shifted in his expression. The colonel had been like a second father to him, a mentor who had guided his military career when his actual father had been too busy with surgery to attend graduations or promotions or any of the other moments that marked a soldier's progression through the ranks. You are giving up on him, Nathan said, and his voice carried an accusation that was directed at Hayes but seemed to include everyone present. Just like that, you are letting him die. Lieutenant, Hayes said, and his professional composure was fracturing under the weight of too many impossible decisions. I am doing what I have to do. I am triaging based on survivability and resource allocation. It is the correct medical decision. Nathan looked at Hayes, then at his father, Robert Caldwell, who was standing 3 feet away saying nothing. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet with the kind of rage that was more dangerous than shouting. Is it? Because from where I stand, it looks like you are failing. It looks like soldiers are dying because you do not know what you are doing. It looks like we need someone who actually understands battlefield trauma, not a doctor who panics under pressure. Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but Sergeant Laura Reeves spoke first. Her eyes locked on Caldwell with an intensity that suggested she had made a decision that she could not unmake. Specialist Caldwell, she said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over the medical area. I know you have been hiding something. I know your file does not match your skills. I have watched you for 9 months, and I have seen the way you look at injuries, the way your hands move when you think no one is paying attention. My father is dying, and Captain Hayes just declared him unsavable. But I think you know different. I think you know exactly how to save him. Caldwell looked at her, this young woman who had hated him for 4 years, and saw in her eyes the same desperate hope that he had seen in countless family members over 3 decades of telling people that their loved ones were going to live or going to die based on decisions that surgeons made in operating rooms. Sergeant, I am a combat medic. I follow. Do not tell me you follow orders, Laura Reeves interrupted, her voice shaking with emotion. Do not tell me you are just a medic. Tell me the truth. Can you save my father or can you not? The moment stretched between them, silent except for the background sounds of soldiers groaning in pain and equipment alarms beeping their warnings about patients whose vital signs were deteriorating. Caldwell looked at Colonel Reeves bleeding in the dust, looked at his son, Nathan, watching with eyes that pleaded for something his father had never been able to give him, looked at Captain Derek Hayes, who owed him everything and had given him nothing in return. 4 years ago, Caldwell had made a choice to protect Derek Hayes at the cost of his own career. 4 years ago, he had decided that taking the blame was nobler than exposing the truth. 4 years ago, he had walked away from surgery and told himself that hiding was a form of penance. But Colonel Vincent Reeves was dying in front of him, and 90 other soldiers needed care that Hayes could not provide, and Caldwell could either continue hiding or he could be the surgeon he had spent 32 years becoming. He made his decision in the space of a single heartbeat. Sergeant Reeves, Caldwell said, his voice steady with the kind of calm authority that came from 3 decades of making life and death decisions. I need you to get me a field surgical kit. I need 4 units of O-negative blood. I need someone to set up portable lighting. And I need everyone to clear this space. Hayes stared at him. Caldwell, what are you? Captain Hayes, Caldwell interrupted, and his voice carried a tone that made it clear this was not a suggestion. You are relieved. Step back and let me work. You cannot relieve me. I am an officer and you are an enlisted. Then court-martial me afterward, Caldwell said. After I saved Colonel Reeves. He knelt beside the colonel and began his examination with hands that moved with the practiced precision of someone who had performed this exact assessment thousands of times. His fingers palpated the abdomen, feeling for the telltale rigidity that indicated internal bleeding. He checked pulses, noting the thready quality that meant hypovolemic shock. He examined the crush injuries, his experienced touch identifying exactly which organs were damaged and which were intact. Laura Reeves was already moving, getting the surgical supplies that Caldwell had requested, and Nathan was helping to set up the portable lighting that would turn this patch of dusty ground into an improvised operating theater. Other soldiers gathered to watch, sensing that something significant was happening, but not quite understanding what it meant that an old enlisted medic was preparing to perform surgery in a combat zone. Sergeant, Caldwell said to Laura Reeves as she returned with the supplies, I am going to perform an emergency laparotomy to control your father's internal bleeding. I will need you to assist. Can you do that? Laura looked at him, and Caldwell saw the moment when she decided to trust the man she had spent 4 years hating. Yes, tell me what you need. What followed was 90 minutes of surgery that should not have been possible with field equipment and improvised conditions. 90 minutes during which Robert Caldwell proved that 68 years old meant experience rather than obsolescence. That hands which had not performed surgery in 4 years remembered every technique and every movement with the precision of muscle memory that could not be erased by time. Caldwell worked with the focused intensity of someone for whom the operating field was the only reality that mattered. His first incision was a midline laparotomy, the scalpel cutting through skin and fascia with the controlled pressure that came from performing this exact movement thousands of times over 3 decades. Blood welled in the incision line, but Caldwell's hands were already moving to control it, his fingers placing hemostats with the kind of automatic precision that happened when conscious thought gave way to pure surgical instinct. Laura Reeves assisted with hands that were steady despite her fear, watching as Caldwell's experienced touch exposed her father's abdominal cavity layer by layer, each movement economical and purposeful in a way that her own medical training had not prepared her to fully appreciate. She had assisted in surgeries before during her medic training, but those had been controlled demonstrations in sterile operating rooms with attending physicians who moved with careful deliberation. This was something different. This was a surgeon who had internalized his craft so completely that the distinction between thinking about what to do and actually doing it had ceased to exist. "Retract here," Caldwell said, his voice calm despite the critical nature of the surgery. "Hold steady." "Good. Now I need the hemostats from the tray." Laura handed them to him before he finished the sentence, her hands moving in sync with his instructions, and she saw him notice the anticipation with a slight nod of approval that suggested he recognized natural surgical talent when he encountered it. The ruptured spleen appeared in the surgical field, dark and hemorrhaging into the peritoneal cavity, with the kind of steady bleeding that would kill within an hour if not controlled. Caldwell examined the injury with the quick assessment of someone who had seen hundreds of splenic ruptures and knew instantly which ones could be repaired and which required removal. This one was salvageable, a polar injury that had torn the capsule but left the main vasculature intact. Most surgeons in field conditions would have removed the entire spleen, the safe choice that eliminated bleeding, but also eliminated an organ that served important immune functions. Caldwell made the harder choice. He would repair it. His fingers worked with steady precision, despite the cramped conditions and inadequate lighting, suturing the splenic capsule with technique that required perfect tension to close the tear without causing additional damage. Too loose and the bleeding would continue. Too tight and the sutures would tear through friable tissue and make the injury worse. Caldwell's hands found the exact middle point, the Goldilocks zone of surgical repair that existed only in the muscle memory of experienced surgeons. Around them, soldiers watched in silence, broken only by the sounds of equipment, alarms, and distant voices calling for medical assistance. They did not fully understand what they were seeing, but they understood that this was not normal, that the old man everyone had dismissed was performing surgery with a level of skill that seemed impossible for someone working in the dust with field instruments and improvised lighting. Master Sergeant Cole Martinez stood closest, having helped carry Colonel Reeves from the rubble, and he watched Caldwell's hands move with the kind of intense focus that suggested he was trying to memorize every detail to tell later. Martinez had seen combat surgeons work in field hospitals, had watched doctors perform emergency procedures under difficult conditions, but he had never seen anyone work like this, with a confidence and precision that suggested the difficulty of the conditions was irrelevant compared to the clarity of surgical purpose. The liver laceration was next, a deep tear in the right lobe that was bleeding steadily into the abdominal cavity and contributing to the hypovolemic shock that was killing Colonel Reeves. Caldwell examined the injury with practiced eyes, his fingers palpating the extent of the damage, while his mind calculated the fastest way to control bleeding without causing additional trauma. "Pack here with hemostatic gauze," he said to Laura, guiding her hands to the correct position. "Apply pressure, but not too much. We want to control bleeding without crushing the tissue." "Good. Hold that while I ligate these vessels." His hands moved to tie off small arterial bleeders, his fingers manipulating suture material with the kind of dexterity that should have declined with age but somehow had not. Perhaps because surgical technique was less about raw physical ability and more about the accumulated wisdom of knowing exactly how much pressure to apply and exactly where to place each stitch. The liver bleeding slowed, then stopped, and Caldwell moved to the next injury with the methodical efficiency of someone working through a mental checklist that had been refined over 3 decades. The pelvic fractures had caused the most immediately life-threatening injury, tearing blood vessels in a way that created hemorrhage hidden deep in tissue where direct visualization was difficult. Caldwell's hands explored the injury by touch more than sight, his fingers reading the geography of torn vessels and displaced bone fragments, the way a blind person might read Braille. He found the torn iliac artery by feel, his experienced touch identifying the injury that was pumping blood into the pelvic cavity faster than the body could compensate. "Clamp," he said, and Laura handed him the instrument with hands that were beginning to understand the rhythm of his requests. Caldwell applied the clamp to control bleeding, then began the delicate work of repairing a vessel that was surrounded by fractured bone and damaged tissue, working in a space barely large enough for his hands and instruments. This was the kind of surgery that most doctors would not attempt even in fully equipped operating rooms with proper lighting and assistance. But Caldwell's hands moved with the confidence of someone who had repaired similar injuries so many times that difficult had become routine. He placed sutures with microscopic precision, his aging eyes still sharp enough to see the fine detail of vascular repair, his fingers still sensitive enough to feel when tension was correct. Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell had joined the circle of soldiers watching the surgery, and he stood there seeing his father in a way he had not seen him since childhood, back when Robert Caldwell had been the heroic surgeon who saved lives rather than the absent father who missed soccer games and school plays. Nathan watched his father's hands move with steady precision despite being 68 years old, watched him work with a level of focus that made everything else in the world disappear, and he began to understand something about why surgery had consumed so much of his father's life. This was what Robert Caldwell was born to do. This was where he made sense in a way that family life and normal conversation never quite had. In this moment, covered in blood and working in impossible conditions to save a dying man, Caldwell was more himself than he had ever been sitting at dinner tables or attending parent-teacher conferences. The realization did not erase Nathan's anger about all the missed moments, but it added context that shifted the anger into something more complex, something that might eventually become understanding if given enough time. Caldwell worked steadily for 90 minutes, his hands never trembling despite age and exertion, his focus never wavering despite the exhaustion that must have been accumulating in muscles that were 68 years old and had not performed surgery in 4 years. He repaired the splenic injury, controlled the liver bleeding, fixed the torn iliac artery, and then carefully closed the abdominal incision with sutures that were placed with the same precision he had used for the internal repairs. When he finally sent everybody back from the completed surgery, Colonel Vincent Reeves's vital signs were stable, his bleeding controlled, his chance of survival transformed from near zero to probable with proper follow-up care. Caldwell had performed battlefield surgery that would have been impressive in a fully equipped hospital and was nearly miraculous in field conditions with improvised equipment. The soldiers watching erupted into spontaneous applause, the kind of genuine appreciation that came from witnessing something extraordinary, but Caldwell barely seemed to notice. He was already focused on the next task, already thinking about the 90 other casualties who still needed care, already moving past the surgery that had just proven he was still capable of practicing medicine at the highest level. 90 minutes after beginning the surgery, Caldwell closed the incision and stepped back to assess his work. Colonel Vincent Reeves's vital signs were stable. The bleeding had been controlled. The patient would need additional surgery at a proper hospital, but he would survive long enough to get there. Caldwell turned to Laura Reeves, who was staring at him with an expression that suggested her understanding of reality had just been fundamentally revised. "Your father is stable, Sergeant. He will need evacuation to Bagram for additional treatment, but he is going to live." Laura opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She looked at her father, at Caldwell, at the surgical instruments still stained with blood, and Caldwell could see her trying to reconcile what she had just witnessed with what she believed about the man who had killed her brother. "Who are you?" she asked finally. "Just a medic doing his job," Caldwell said. "Now I need to get back to treating the other casualties." He walked away from Colonel Reeves toward the medical tent, where 90 soldiers still needed care, and this time when he examined patients, he did not hold back his full knowledge. A soldier with a tension pneumothorax got a needle decompression performed with the kind of confident precision that came from having done it hundreds of times. A soldier with a suspected spinal injury got careful stabilization using techniques that most combat medics would not have known. A soldier with compartment syndrome got an emergency fasciotomy performed in the field because waiting for evacuation would have meant losing the limb. Caldwell moved through the casualties using 32 years of surgical experience, and soldiers who would have died under Hayes's triage protocols survived because someone who actually understood battlefield trauma was making the decisions. The death count stopped rising at 53. The number of critical casualties began declining as Caldwell stabilized patients who Hayes had declared unsavable. And Captain Derek Hayes stood at the edge of the medical tent watching his former mentor save lives with skills that should not have existed. Watching the old man he had dismissed prove that age meant wisdom rather than weakness. Watching the foundation of his own medical confidence crack under the weight of inadequacy that could no longer be denied. By 1600 hours, 8 hours after the attack had begun, the immediate crisis was over. The critically wounded had been stabilized. The minor casualties had been treated. Medevac helicopters were finally arriving to transport the most serious cases to Bagram. And Robert Caldwell stood in the medical tent covered in blood and dust, and the evidence of having performed surgery that no one could pretend had been standard combat medicine. Sergeant Laura Reeves approached him slowly, her expression carrying emotions that Caldwell could not quite read. Her father was alive because of him. Dozens of other soldiers were alive because of him. Everything she had believed about who he was and what he had done had been challenged by watching him work. "Specialist Caldwell," she said, her voice quiet enough that only he could hear. "I need to ask you something. That surgery you performed on my father, that was not something a combat medic learns in Army medical training." Caldwell looked at her and made a decision. "No, it was not." "Then where did you learn it?" Before Caldwell could answer, Captain Derek Hayes appeared, his face flushed with anger that was really fear wearing a different mask. The younger doctor had spent 8 hours watching his inadequacies exposed, 8 hours understanding that soldiers had died because of his mistakes, while the old man he had dismissed saved lives that Hayes could not, and the cognitive dissonance was more than he could handle. "Specialist Caldwell," Hayes said, his voice tight with rage, "you are going to explain to me how an enlisted medic performed battlefield surgery without authorization. You are going to explain who you really are and what you are really doing at this FOB." Laura Reeves turned to Hayes. "Captain, with respect, Specialist Caldwell saved my father's life and the lives of at least 30 other soldiers. Whatever questions you have can wait until—" "No," Hayes interrupted. "They cannot wait. Because if Specialist Caldwell had the skills to save those soldiers, then he had the skills to save them all along. Which means he has been hiding his capabilities while men died. Which means he let soldiers suffer when he could have helped them." It was the accusation that Caldwell had known would come, the question that had no good answer, and he stood there in the Afghan dust covered in blood from saving lives while being accused of letting soldiers die. And the terrible irony of it was that Hayes was absolutely right. "I did," Caldwell said quietly. "I let soldiers suffer. I made the choice to hide rather than help, and I will have to live with that." Hayes's expression shifted to something that might have been triumph if it had not been undercut by desperation. "Then you admit you have been lying. You admit you are not what your file says. Who are you really?" Caldwell looked at the younger doctor who owed him everything, looked at Sergeant Laura Reeves, who was beginning to understand that the truth was more complicated than she had believed, looked at his son Nathan, who stood at the edge of the group watching with an expression that suggested hope fighting against years of disappointment. "My name is Robert Caldwell. 4 years ago, I was the chief of trauma surgery at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. 4 years ago, a patient died on my operating table because the attending surgeon made a fatal error. 4 years ago, I took responsibility for that death, even though I was not the one holding the scalpel." He paused, letting the words settle, watching Hayes' face go from flushed anger to pale comprehension. "Tell them," Caldwell said to Hayes. "Tell them who killed Captain Daniel Reeves. Tell them who was drunk in the operating room. Tell them who made the mistake that severed the femoral artery." Hayes stood frozen, his mouth open but no words emerging, and the silence stretched until Laura Reeves spoke with a voice that shook with the effort of controlling rage. "Captain Hayes, my brother died at Walter Reed 4 years ago. Dr. Caldwell was listed as the supervising surgeon. Are you telling me that you were responsible for my brother's death?" Hayes looked at her, looked at all the soldiers gathered around who had just watched Caldwell save lives while Hayes had failed, and something broke in him. "I was drinking," Hayes said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was drunk, and I made a mistake. I severed the wrong artery. Dr. Caldwell tried to fix it, but there was not enough time. Your brother died because of me, and Caldwell took the blame to protect my career." Laura Reeves stared at Hayes with an expression that cycled through shock and comprehension and fury. For 4 years, she had hated the wrong man. For 4 years, she had blamed Caldwell for something Hayes had done. For 4 years, the man who had destroyed her family had been walking free, while the man who had tried to save her brother had lost everything. "You," she said to Hayes, her voice shaking, "you killed my brother and let someone else take the blame. You coward. You pathetic coward." Hayes had no answer, and in that moment, Robert Caldwell saw the final collapse of the man he had once believed would be the future of trauma surgery. Derek Hayes had been brilliant and talented and full of potential, but he had also been weak where it mattered most, unable to face his mistakes and willing to let others pay for his failures. And Caldwell had enabled that weakness by taking the blame, had protected Hayes when exposing the truth would have been harder but more honest, had chosen the easier path of personal destruction over the difficult path of holding people accountable for their actions. "I should have let you face the consequences," Caldwell said to Hayes. "I should have told the truth 4 years ago. I thought protecting you was the noble choice, but all I did was enable you to continue being the kind of doctor who makes mistakes and blames others." Hayes said nothing. There was nothing left to say. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. And unlike Caldwell, who had sacrificed himself by choice, Hayes would lose everything because his own weakness had finally been exposed. Colonel Vincent Reeves was loaded onto a medevac helicopter, stable enough to survive the flight to Bagram, but still critical enough to require immediate additional surgery. Laura Reeves stood beside the helicopter holding her father's hand, and before she climbed aboard, she turned back to look at Caldwell. "Thank you," she said, "for my father, for all of them. And I am sorry for everything." Caldwell nodded, accepting the apology that could never fully balance 4 years of hatred, and watched the helicopter lift off into the Afghan sunset, carrying the man who had orchestrated this test, and the daughter who finally understood the truth. Night fell over FOB Sentinel, and Robert Caldwell stood in the medical tent surrounded by evidence of the day's carnage. 53 soldiers dead and 164 wounded, and he tried to calculate whether revealing himself had been worth the cost of 4 years hiding. He had saved lives today that would have died under Hayes's incompetent care, but he had also let soldiers die over 9 months because maintaining his cover seemed more important than using his skills. The mathematics of redemption refused to balance, and Caldwell suspected they never would. Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell found him there as the last casualties were being loaded for evacuation, and father and son stood in uncomfortable silence for a long moment before Nathan spoke. "I watched you today. I saw what you did, and I am trying to understand why you hid that for 9 months while soldiers suffered." Caldwell met his son's eyes. "Because I thought I deserved to be punished. Because your mother died while I was protecting Derek Hayes instead of being with her. Because I believed that hiding was appropriate penance for all the ways I had failed." Nathan was quiet, processing this, and when he spoke, his voice carried something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "That is the stupidest thing I have ever heard," Nathan said. "Punishing yourself does not bring Mom back. It does not save Captain Reeves. It just means more people suffer for mistakes that were not even yours." "I know," Caldwell said. "I know that now." Father and son stood together in the gathering darkness, and for the first time in 5 years, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge that might eventually be crossed. The medevac helicopter appeared at 1600 hours, 9 hours after the attack that had turned Forward Operating Base Sentinel into a graveyard where the living still outnumbered the dead, but only barely. Robert Caldwell stood beside the makeshift stretcher where Colonel Vincent Reeves lay stabilized from emergency surgery, his 68-year-old body aching from 9 hours of continuous medical care, without rest or food or anything beyond the occasional sip of water grabbed between treating casualties, and watched the UH-60 Blackhawk descend toward the landing zone with the kind of careful hope that came from decades of learning that rescue was never guaranteed until patients were actually loaded and airborne. The helicopter was 50 feet from touchdown, close enough that Caldwell could see the flight medic in the cargo bay preparing equipment for patient transfer, close enough that the rotor wash was kicking up dust that stung eyes and forced soldiers to turn away, when the first tracer round cut through the afternoon sky like a bright scratch across blue canvas. The rounder originated from the hills to the east, a position that should have been clear of enemy presence according to the hasty reconnaissance that had been conducted after the morning's attack, and it passed close enough to the Blackhawk's tail rotor that the pilot's evasive maneuver was both immediate and violent. The helicopter pulled up hard, its nose pitching skyward as the pilot added full power and broke left away from the incoming fire. More tracer rounds followed the first, at least 3 separate firing positions lighting up the hillside with a distinctive pattern of coordinated anti-aircraft ambush. And within seconds, the Blackhawk was climbing away from FOB Sentinel at maximum rate while the radio crackled with transmissions that carried the controlled urgency of pilots under fire. "Sentinel Base, this is Dustoff 3-1, taking effective enemy anti-aircraft fire from multiple positions east of your location. Cannot complete landing under current conditions. Repeat, we are aborting landing due to enemy AA threat." Caldwell watched the helicopter climb to safe altitude and begin a wide orbit beyond effective range of the ground fire, and he felt something cold settle in his chest as the implications became clear. Colonel Reeves needed hospital care within the next 4 hours, or the emergency surgery that Caldwell had performed would become irrelevant because the patient would die from complications that could only be managed in a proper medical facility. Blood products, advanced monitoring, potential follow-up procedures, all of it required equipment and resources that did not exist at FOB Sentinel's improvised medical tent. The radio continued its mechanical back and forth between ground controllers and the frustrated pilot circling overhead, and Caldwell listened to the exchange with the automatic assessment of someone calculating probability of survival against time remaining. Sentinel Base, can you provide suppressive fire on enemy positions? If you can clear the AA threat, we can attempt landing. Negative, dust off 3-1. Our heavy weapons were destroyed in the ammunition explosion. We do not have capability to engage hillside positions at that range. Understood. Request you contact higher for air support to clear enemy positions. We will maintain holding pattern at safe distance. It was the logical protocol, the safe tactical decision that put helicopter crew safety ahead of a single casualty's medical needs. And Caldwell could not fault the pilot for refusing to land under fire. But logic and safety were sometimes enemies of survival, and Colonel Vincent Reeves did not have time to wait for air support to arrive, locate enemy positions, conduct strikes, perform battle damage assessment, and clear the landing zone for medevac operations. The patient had 4 hours at most. That process would take 6 to 8 even under optimal conditions. Captain Derek Hayes stood nearby, his face still pale from the confrontation that had exposed his role in Captain Daniel Reeves's death 4 years earlier. And when he heard the pilot's transmission, his expression shifted through a sequence of emotions that Caldwell recognized as the cognitive process of someone trying to find an option that did not exist. Hayes had spent the last 4 hours in a state of shocked paralysis, watching Caldwell save lives that Hayes's incompetence had endangered. Understanding that his career was over, but not yet processing what that meant for his future. Now Hayes focused on the immediate problem with the desperate intensity of someone looking for any kind of redemption. Dust off, 3-1, this is Sentinel Base Medical. Can you land at alternate location? We have critical patient who needs immediate evacuation. The radio was silent for a moment while the helicopter circled at a safe distance from the anti-aircraft threat. And when the pilot responded, his voice carried the careful professionalism of someone delivering bad news to people who did not want to hear it. Sentinel Medical, affirmative on alternate LZ. We can land at coordinates November Papa 74, approximately 2.3 miles north of your position. Terrain is clear of AA threat at that location, but we cannot land at your base while under fire. 2.3 miles, Caldwell looked at Colonel Reeves, at the IV lines and monitoring equipment that were keeping him stable, at the surgical dressings that covered the incision from emergency laparotomy, and he began calculating the logistics of moving a critically injured patient over rough terrain to a landing zone that might as well have been on the far side of the moon for all the accessibility it offered. Hayes was making the same calculation and reaching a different conclusion. Sentinel Medical to dust off 3-1. Request you stand by at safe distance. We will attempt to suppress AA positions and clear you for landing at primary LZ. Caldwell shook his head before Hayes finished transmitting. Captain, that will take hours. Air support will need to be coordinated. Ground forces will need to locate and neutralize AA positions. And even if everything goes perfectly, it will be 6 to 8 hours before this LZ is secure. Hayes looked at him with eyes that were red-rimmed from exhaustion and stress. Then what do you suggest, specialist? We cannot move the colonel 2 miles in his condition. He is post-operative from major trauma surgery. The movement alone could kill him. It was the logical assessment, the safe medical judgment that any competent doctor would make when faced with a critically injured patient who needed stability rather than transport over rough terrain. It was also the assessment that would result in Colonel Vincent Reeves dying at FOB Sentinel because safe and logical did not always align with survival when circumstances were extreme. Caldwell had spent 32 years in trauma medicine making decisions that balanced ideal protocols against actual reality, and he knew with absolute certainty that waiting for the landing zone to be secured was the same as accepting that the colonel would die. I will carry him, Caldwell said quietly. The silence that followed his statement was broken only by the distant sound of the helicopter circling and the background noise of soldiers still working to clear rubble from the collapsed barracks. Hayes stared at Caldwell as if the older man had just suggested something so absurd that it did not merit serious consideration. You will carry him. Captain Hayes repeated the words slowly, as if testing whether they made more sense the second time. Specialist Caldwell, Colonel Reeves weighs 210 pounds. You are 68 years old. The terrain between here and that LZ is rough, unsecured, and potentially occupied by the same enemy forces that just attacked this base. You are suggesting that you personally carry a critically injured patient over 2.3 miles of hostile territory. Yes, Caldwell said simply. That is insane. Hayes's voice rose slightly, stress and exhaustion eroding what remained of his professional composure. You could not make it a quarter mile before your body gave out. And even if by some miracle you could carry him that far, the movement would likely restart his internal bleeding. You would kill him before you reached the LZ. Then I will kill him trying to save him, Caldwell replied, his voice still calm, rather than let him die here because we chose the safe option over the right one. Before Hayes could respond, Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell appeared beside them, having heard enough of the exchange to understand what his father was proposing. Nathan's uniform was covered in dust and dried blood from helping to pull soldiers out of the collapsed barracks, and his expression carried the exhausted determination of someone who had spent 9 hours doing physically demanding work that saved lives one shovelful of rubble at a time. Dad, Nathan said, and it was the first time in 5 years that he had used that word instead of specialist or Caldwell or just avoiding direct address entirely. Dad, you cannot carry a 200-pound man 2 miles. Not at your age, not in this terrain, not after working for 9 hours straight without rest. Caldwell looked at his son and saw genuine concern in Nathan's eyes. Concern that felt like the first indication that maybe the bridge between them was not as completely destroyed as both of them had believed. I carried guilt for 4 years, Nathan. I can carry a man for 2 miles. Nathan opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, understanding that logic was not going to change his father's mind when the old man had already made a decision based on something deeper than rational calculation. Instead, Nathan tried a different approach. Then let me carry him. I am 32 years old. I am in peak physical condition. I can make that distance faster and with less risk to the patient. It was a generous offer, the kind of selfless gesture that proved Nathan had learned the right lessons about leadership even if his father had not been the one to teach most of them. But Caldwell shook his head with the same gentle firmness that he had used when Nathan was a child trying to help with tasks that required more skill than strength. Son, you are needed here to coordinate the ongoing rescue operations. Your platoon looks to you for leadership. But more than that, carrying a trauma patient is not about strength or speed. It is about knowing how to position the body to minimize stress on surgical repairs, how to monitor vital signs while moving, how to recognize when internal bleeding is restarting and adjust accordingly. You are an excellent infantry officer, but this requires a surgeon's knowledge combined with a medic's field skills. Nathan absorbed this with visible frustration, understanding that his father was correct, but hating that the correctness meant a 68-year-old man would be attempting something that could kill him. Before he could formulate another argument, Sergeant Laura Reeves joined the conversation, her presence announced by the sound of her boots on the packed earth. Laura had spent the last 4 hours processing the revelation that Captain Derek Hayes had killed her brother and that Dr. Robert Caldwell had taken the blame to protect Hayes' career. The emotional journey from hatred to understanding was not complete, would probably never be fully complete, but she had reached a point where she could separate what she had believed from what was true. If you are carrying my father, she said to Caldwell, then I am going with you. Caldwell turned to face her, seeing in her eyes the same determination that he had seen when she had assisted him during Colonel Reeves' surgery. Sergeant, it is 2.3 miles through potentially hostile territory. You will be needed here to assist with ongoing medical care for the other casualties. My father is the most critical casualty we have, Laura said firmly, and you just spent 90 minutes teaching me how to assist in trauma surgery. If his condition deteriorates during transport, you will need someone who understands what you are doing well enough to help. That is me. She was correct, and Caldwell knew it. Having a trained medic accompany him would increase the colonel's chances of survival if complications developed during the journey. More than that, Laura Reeves had earned the right to be present for her father's evacuation after spending 4 years hating the wrong man, while the actual person responsible for her brother's death had walked free. All right, Caldwell said, get your medical kit. Bring extra IV fluids, hemostatic dressings, and a handheld monitor for vital signs. We move in 10 minutes. Laura nodded and hurried toward the medical tent, while Caldwell began the process of preparing Colonel Reeves for transport. The IV lines had to be secured so they would not pull out during movement. The surgical dressings needed reinforcement to prevent contamination. The monitoring equipment had to be disconnected and replaced with portable alternatives that Laura could carry. Captain Hayes watched these preparations with an expression that cycled between concern and resentment. And finally, he spoke in a voice that carried defensive anger, masking deeper emotions. If you fail, if the colonel dies during this insane attempt, it will be on you. Everyone will know that Dr. Robert Caldwell, the great trauma surgeon, killed a patient through reckless decision-making. Caldwell looked at him steadily. Captain Hayes, everyone already knows that I took responsibility for your mistake 4 years ago. If I fail today, it will be because I tried and lost, which is different from succeeding by letting others take the blame. You should understand the distinction. Hayes had no response, and Caldwell returned his attention to preparing the patient while his former protege stood nearby carrying the weight of exposure that could not be reversed. 10 minutes later, Robert Caldwell lifted Colonel Vincent Reeves onto his shoulders in a fireman's carry, 210 pounds of unconscious patient settling across his 68-year-old frame with the kind of immediate physical burden that made his knees buckle slightly before his muscles adapted to the load. Pain shot through his lower back, the complaint of a spine that had not been designed to carry this kind of weight at this age. But Caldwell ignored it with the practiced discipline of someone who had learned over 6 decades that pain was just information and could be acknowledged without being obeyed. Sergeant Laura Reeves stood beside him carrying both medical kits and the portable monitoring equipment, her face set in determined lines that suggested she had made peace with whatever consequences this journey might bring. Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell stood watching with an expression that mixed concern, pride, and fear in proportions that he could not have articulated even if asked. The walk from the FOB to the northern LZ took them through terrain that was exposed and rough, an open valley dotted with rocks and scattered vegetation that offered minimal cover and maximum visibility to anyone watching from the surrounding hills. The afternoon sun was descending toward the western mountains, painting everything in the golden light that preceded sunset, and Caldwell could feel his body protesting the weight he carried with every step. The first quarter mile was a test of whether his aging muscles could sustain the load long enough to matter. Caldwell's legs burned with exertion that went beyond normal fatigue, each step requiring conscious recruitment of muscle fibers that wanted to quit, that were sending urgent signals to his brain, suggesting that this was too much weight for too long at too old an age. His shoulders ached under the colonel's weight, with a deep grinding pain that radiated down his spine and into his hips, the vertebrae compressing under load in ways that 68-year-old backs were not designed to accommodate. His breathing came in measured gasps that spoke of cardiovascular systems being pushed beyond comfortable limits. His heart rate elevated to levels that would have concerned any cardiologist monitoring an aging patient under extreme physical stress. But Caldwell had not lied when he told Nathan that carrying was less about strength and more about knowledge. He knew from decades of studying human physiology how to position a body to distribute weight across his skeletal frame in ways that minimize stress on any single joint or muscle group. He knew how to pace his breathing in rhythm with his steps, maximizing oxygen delivery to working muscles through techniques he had learned during residency when understanding respiratory physiology had been essential to managing ventilated patients. He knew how to lock into a sustainable rhythm that would let him cover distance without burning out his energy reserves before reaching the destination. More than mechanical knowledge, Caldwell understood something about endurance that only came from lived experience. He had survived 36-hour shifts during surgical residency, periods when sleep deprivation became a form of controlled torture that young doctors accepted as necessary preparation for careers where life and death decisions could not wait for convenient rest schedules. He had stood in operating rooms for 12 consecutive hours, performing complex surgeries that required absolute focus despite hands cramping and backs spasming and feet swelling inside surgical shoes. He had lived through the long deterioration of his marriage, watching his wife grow distant and his son grow resentful, while he carried the emotional weight of knowing he was failing them, but not knowing how to change patterns established over 3 decades. Compared to those burdens, compared to 4 years of accepting blame for someone else's fatal error and watching his reputation destroyed while the actual guilty party walked free, 210 pounds of patient was just physics. Pain was just sensation. Exhaustion was just a state of mind that could be acknowledged without being obeyed. Laura walked beside him through this first quarter mile, her eyes constantly checking the portable monitor that tracked her father's vital signs. And when she spoke after the first 10 minutes, her voice carried relief that was being carefully controlled beneath professional composure. Blood pressure stable at 100/70, heart rate elevated to 95, but within acceptable parameters for his condition. Oxygen saturation good. No signs of renewed internal bleeding based on his abdominal rigidity. You are doing fine, specialist. You are actually doing fine. The reassurance helped more than Caldwell would have admitted, confirming that his worst fear, that the movement would restart Colonel Reeves's bleeding and turn the rescue attempt into the thing that killed him, was not manifesting. But Caldwell's primary focus remained on the mechanics of movement, the careful placement of each foot on uneven ground that could turn an ankle or catch a toe and send both carrier and patient crashing down, the constant micro-adjustments of balance that kept 210 pounds stable on shoulders that were not designed for sustained heavy loads. His body wanted to quit. His muscles screamed for rest with increasing urgency. His joints protested the sustained load with sharp pains that radiated through knees and hips and ankles in ways that suggested structural damage was accumulating with each step. But wanting to quit and actually quitting were different categories of experience. And Caldwell had spent 6 decades learning to exist in the space between desire and action. The second quarter mile brought a different kind of challenge, as Caldwell's body adapted to the sustained load, but fatigue began accumulating in ways that steady pacing could not fully address. His quadriceps muscles, the large muscle groups in his thighs responsible for the repetitive motion of walking, began to develop the fine tremor that indicated they were operating at the edge of sustainable output. His breathing grew harsher despite his attempts to keep it measured and controlled, his aging lungs struggling to extract enough oxygen from thin Afghan air to meet the demands of muscles working at maximum capacity. Sweat soaked through his uniform in the late afternoon heat, and he could feel dehydration beginning to affect his coordination in subtle ways. Slight delays between when his brain commanded a movement and when his body executed it. Laura noticed the trembling in his legs and spoke with concern that she was trying unsuccessfully to keep purely professional, the worry of a daughter watching someone else's father risk himself to save her own bleeding through the medic's trained objectivity. Specialist, you need to rest. Your legs are shaking. Let me help carry him for just a few minutes while you recover your strength. Caldwell kept walking, his voice steady despite the exertion and the effort required to speak, while maintaining the breathing rhythm that was keeping him upright. Cannot transfer the load safely, Sergeant. Position changes could stress his surgical repairs. The incision is held with field sutures that might not tolerate the movement of being shifted from one carrier to another. We keep moving. But you are going to collapse if you do not rest. I can see your coordination degrading. You nearly stumbled 3 steps ago. Then I will collapse at the landing zone, not before. Because stopping now means accepting that I might not be able to start again, and the colonel does not have time for me to find out whether 68-year-old muscles can recover from rest, or whether they will refuse to resume load once given permission to quit. Laura was silent for several steps, processing this, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, an emotion that sounded like the beginning of respect mixing with the residue of 4 years of hatred that could not be erased instantly even by revelations of truth. You are the most stubborn man I have ever met, Specialist Caldwell. It is a terrible quality in someone I spent 4 years believing killed my brother. It is going to save my father's life. Caldwell would have smiled if he had the energy to spare for facial expressions, but instead he focused on the next step and the step after that, reducing his entire existence to the simple mechanics of forward progress that made distance remaining and strength left the only variables that mattered in a universe that had contracted to the narrow space between where he was and where he needed to be. The terrain itself became an enemy as they progressed past the half-mile mark, the relatively flat valley floor giving way to ground that was increasingly rocky and uneven. Each step required visual assessment of foot placement to avoid loose stones that could roll and twist an ankle, to identify stable surfaces that would support combined weight without shifting, to navigate around obstacles that a younger person might have simply stepped over, but that represented potential disaster for someone carrying a heavy load with degraded coordination. Caldwell's left foot came down on a patch of loose gravel that shifted beneath his weight, and the sudden loss of stable footing sent him staggering 2 steps to the side before he caught his balance. The movement jolted Colonel Reeves enough that Laura's monitor alarm briefly sounded, her father's heart rate spiking from the disturbance, and Caldwell froze in place until the alarm silenced and vital signs returned to baseline. "Sorry, sir," Caldwell said quietly to his unconscious passenger. "Trying to keep this smooth for you." They continued, and Caldwell's world narrowed further until it consisted only of the ground immediately in front of his feet, the weight on his shoulders, the rhythm of breathing that was becoming increasingly ragged, and the distant goal of a landing zone that might as well have been on another continent for all the accessibility it seemed to offer. At the half-mile mark, Colonel Reeves regained consciousness with the abrupt disorientation of someone waking from sedation into a situation that made no logical sense. His voice was weak but audible, carrying confusion that was understandable, given that he was being carried through the Afghan desert by a man he had spent 9 months testing. "Caldwell, what are you doing?" "Saving your life, sir. Respectfully, please remain still." Reeves processed this for a moment, his sedation-fogged brain trying to understand why being carried was necessary when helicopters existed and medical facilities had equipment designed for patient transport. "Put me down. You will hurt yourself." "Already hurting, sir. A little more will not make much difference." Reeves tried to shift position, and Caldwell felt the movement as a disruption to carefully maintain balance. "Sir, you need to stay motionless. Your surgical repairs are holding, but any significant movement could restart the bleeding." The colonel went still, understanding finally filtering through the sedation, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been gratitude, or might have been regret, or might have been both. "Why are you doing this, Robert? After everything I put you through, after spending 9 months testing whether you were a coward or a man of honor, why risk yourself for me?" Caldwell kept walking, his legs trembling with sustained exertion, and his answer was simple enough that it required no elaboration. "Because saving lives is what I do, sir. It is the only thing I have ever been good at." They covered the next quarter-mile in silence, broken only by the sound of Caldwell's labored breathing and Laura's periodic updates on her father's vital signs. The sun continued its descent, and shadows lengthened across the valley floor, and Caldwell's body continued its protest against being asked to do something that should have been impossible for someone his age. At 1 mile, Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell appeared with his 4-man fire team, having left the FOB, once he received word that his father was actually attempting the insane task of carrying a critically injured patient over 2 miles of unsecured terrain. Nathan had spent the last 30 minutes moving at double time through the same route his father was walking, and when he caught up to the slow-moving group, his face showed the conflict between tactical concern and personal emotion that came from watching a parent attempt something that could kill them. "Dad," Nathan said as he fell into step beside them, his breathing only slightly elevated despite having run to catch up, "enemy activity has been quiet since the initial attack this morning, but we are getting reports from observation posts of possible spotters in the hills to the east. My team will provide security overwatch while you complete the movement to the LZ." Caldwell nodded acknowledgement, grateful for the tactical support, but unable to spare the breath required for extended conversation. His oxygen was being consumed entirely by muscles that were operating at the ragged edge of sustainable output, and every word he spoke meant less air available for the mechanical work of putting one foot in front of the other. Nathan walked beside his father in silence for several minutes, watching the older man's trembling legs and increasingly labored breathing. Seeing the physical cost of this rescue attempt, written in tremors and sweat, in the careful way Caldwell was placing each foot as if unsure whether his next step would hold or collapse. It was painful to witness this visible evidence of aging and limitation in a man Nathan had spent his childhood believing was invincible, and the conflict between wanting to help and understanding that help was not possible created a frustration that demanded some kind of outlet. "When Mom was dying," Nathan said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only his father could hear, "I was so angry that you were not there. I could not understand why you would choose to be at work when she was in hospice asking for you. I thought you had prioritized your career over the person who had spent 35 years supporting that career. I called you selfish. I called you a coward. I said things that I can never take back." Caldwell kept walking, his legs shaking with each step, and he wanted to respond, but his lungs were already operating at capacity and speaking would mean reducing the oxygen available for movement. So he just listened while his son spoke words that had apparently been building for 5 years. But watching you now, watching you do this thing that should be impossible for someone your age, watching you risk everything to save Colonel Reeves after he spent 9 months testing you and judging you and making your life difficult, I am starting to understand something that I should have understood years ago. You were not choosing career over family. You were just being who you are fundamentally. A man who cannot walk away when lives need saving. A man who will endure any amount of personal suffering if it means someone else survives. Nathan paused, collecting thoughts that were clearly difficult to articulate while walking through hostile territory, watching his father's body slowly fail under sustained load. Mom understood that about you even when I did not. She told me once, near the end when she was still lucid enough for real conversation, that she had known what she was marrying when she married a surgeon. That she had chosen to love a man whose first instinct would always be to save strangers rather than comfort family. She said she never regretted it, even though it meant spending a lot of nights alone and raising a son who barely knew his father. She said the world needed people like you more than it needed another good husband or attentive father. Caldwell's vision blurred, and he could not be certain whether it was from sweat running into his eyes or from tears that he did not have the capacity to cry while his body was focused entirely on the mechanics of not collapsing. He wanted to tell Nathan that his mother had been wrong, that the world did not need surgeons more than it needed present fathers, that he would trade every life he had saved for the chance to have been there when Sarah was dying. But he could not speak, and perhaps that was appropriate because some truths were too painful to say aloud, and some regrets were too deep to be resolved through words. I'm not saying I forgive you, Nathan continued, his voice steady, but carrying undertones of emotion that suggested the steady tone was being maintained through effort. I am not saying that 5 years of anger and resentment can be erased because I finally understand your motivations. But I am saying that I see you now in a way I did not before. I see that this is what you were born to do. This is where you make sense in a way that dinner table conversations and school plays never quite allowed. Nathan fell silent then, and they walked together through terrain that was growing increasingly rough, father and son sharing space without the barrier of accumulated grievances, making that space impossible to occupy simultaneously. It was not forgiveness, it was not reconciliation, but it was perhaps the beginning of understanding that might eventually lead to something that looked like peace. At 1.25 miles, Caldwell's coordination had degraded enough that Laura began providing verbal guidance for foot placement, calling out obstacles and unstable ground, with the attentiveness of someone who understood that a fall at this point would likely be catastrophic for both carrier and patient. Rock ahead to your left. Step right. Good. Loose gravel in 3 steps. Shift your weight to your right foot. There you go. Steady now. Caldwell followed her instructions with the automatic compliance of someone whose cognitive resources were entirely consumed by the task of continuing to move forward. His conscious mind having retreated to some deep protected space while his body operated on pure muscle memory and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The 1.5 mile mark brought visible evidence that his body was approaching absolute limits. Caldwell's left knee began to buckle intermittently, the joint simply refusing to fully support weight for brief moments before recovering enough to continue. His breathing had become harsh gasps that sounded painful even to external observers, his aging cardiovascular system struggling to deliver enough oxygen to meet demands that exceeded anything it had been asked to provide in decades. Black spots began appearing in his peripheral vision, the early warning signs of insufficient blood flow to his brain as his body prioritized oxygen delivery to working muscles over maintaining full consciousness. Nathan saw all of this and moved closer, ready to catch his father if the old man's body finally gave out completely, but not interfering because he understood that Caldwell needed to complete this himself or it would mean nothing. Carrying Colonel Reeves to the landing zone was not just about saving a patient. It was about proving to himself and to everyone who had doubted him that 68 years old meant experience rather than obsolescence. That being told you are too old to serve was prejudice rather than medical fact. The 1.75 mile mark was where Caldwell's body began to seriously consider the option of shutting down entirely. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel showing only the ground directly in front of his feet. His hearing had become muffled, as if his ears were stuffed with cotton that filtered out everything except Laura's voice, calling navigation instructions and his own labored breathing. His sense of balance was degrading in ways that made each step feel like a controlled fall that he was catching at the last possible moment. Nathan saw the deterioration and moved closer. "Dad, you need to stop. You are going to pass out." Caldwell kept moving, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Quarter mile left. I can make a quarter mile. Not if you are unconscious when you try. Then catch me if I fall, but I am not stopping." It was the stubbornness that Laura had identified, the terrible quality that made Robert Caldwell refuse to accept defeat even when defeat was the logical outcome. And Nathan recognized it because he had inherited the same trait from his father, even if he had never acknowledged the genetic connection before now. The final quarter mile was a descent into pure physical suffering that transcended anything Caldwell had experienced in 6 decades of pushing his body beyond comfortable limits. Every step sent pain radiating through joints that had been stressed past their design capacity. His muscles were trembling so badly that maintaining balance required conscious effort rather than automatic reflexes. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel that showed only the ground immediately in front of him, and his breathing sounded like someone drowning on dry land. But the landing zone was visible now, a cleared area where the Black Hawk helicopter waited with rotors still turning, and Caldwell focused everything he had left on reaching that final destination. 200 yards, 100 yards, 50 yards. Each step brought closer to salvation or collapse in proportions that were becoming indistinguishable. Colonel Vincent Reeves had remained conscious during the final stretch, and he had felt every trembling step his rescuer took, had heard the deteriorating quality of Caldwell's breathing, had understood with the clarity that comes from being carried by someone whose body was failing that he was witnessing something extraordinary. At 20 yards from the helicopter, Caldwell's left knee gave out completely. The joint that had carried 210 extra pounds for 2.3 miles simply stopped functioning, and Caldwell went down hard on the rocky ground with Colonel Reeves still on his shoulders. Nathan was there instantly, catching his father before the fall could cause additional injury to either man, and together with Laura, they carefully transferred the colonel from Caldwell's shoulders to a proper stretcher that the helicopter's flight medic had brought forward. Caldwell lay on the ground, breathing in great gasping lungfuls of air, while his vision cleared and his body processed what had just been asked of it. He had made it. 2.3 miles carrying 210 pounds at age 68, and Colonel Vincent Reeves was going to survive because an old man had refused to accept that being too old meant being unable to save lives. The flight medic examined the colonel quickly, checking vital signs and surgical dressings, and when he looked up at Laura, his expression carried professional amazement. Whoever performed the emergency surgery did remarkable work, and whoever transported him did it without causing additional trauma. The patient is stable for evacuation. Laura looked at Caldwell, who was still lying on the ground trying to remember how breathing was supposed to work. And when she spoke, her voice carried emotions that would take years to fully process. The same person did both. The man everyone said was too old to serve just proved that age is not about years. It is about what you are willing to endure to save lives that matter. Colonel Reeves was loaded onto the helicopter. Laura climbed aboard to accompany her father to Bagram, and as the Black Hawk lifted into the Afghan sunset, its rotors beating the air in rhythmic thumps that gradually faded with distance, Nathan knelt beside his father and helped the old man sit up on ground that was still warm from the day's heat. "That was the most insane thing I have ever watched anyone do," Nathan said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and residual fear, and something that might have been pride if he could let himself feel it fully. "It was also the most incredible, and I finally understand something that I should have understood years ago. You did not become a surgeon instead of being the father I wanted you to be. You became a surgeon because that is fundamentally who you are. This is what you were born to do. This is where you make sense in a way that normal life never quite allowed." Caldwell looked at his son through vision that was still clearing from the tunnel focus of extreme exertion, and he saw in Nathan's eyes something he had not seen in 5 years. Not forgiveness exactly, because some wounds took longer to heal than a single heroic gesture could address, but at least the willingness to consider that forgiveness might eventually be possible. "Being a surgeon was what I was trained to do," Caldwell said, his voice hoarse from dehydration and heavy breathing. "Being your father was what I was supposed to do, and I am sorry that I confused the two for so long. I am sorry that I prioritized strangers who needed saving over a son who needed a present parent. I am sorry that I was not there when your mother was dying. I am sorry for 32 years of choosing wrong when it came to you." Nathan was quiet for a moment, processing words he had waited 5 years to hear. And when he spoke, his response carried the complexity of someone who had spent a long time being angry and was now discovering that anger alone was not a sustainable emotion. "I do not know if I can forgive you yet, Dad. I do not know if watching you carry Colonel Reeves 2 miles erases all the soccer games you missed, and all the birthdays you forgot, and all the times I needed you and you were in an operating room instead. But I do know that I understand you better now than I did before, and maybe understanding is where forgiveness starts." He helped his father stand on legs that were trembling with exhaustion, so profound that standing felt like its own form of heroism, and together they began the long walk back to FOB Sentinel, through gathering darkness that was painting the Afghan mountains in shades of purple and deep blue. They walked slowly because Caldwell's body was barely functional after what he had just asked it to do, and they walked in silence because some conversations were too important to be rushed, and some reconciliations required time to develop beyond initial gestures. But for the first time in 5 years, the silence between them felt less like a wall built from accumulated grievances and more like the beginning of something that might eventually become a bridge. And that was enough for one day that had already asked for more than any reasonable person could have expected to give. Robert Caldwell woke in the medical tent 48 hours after carrying Colonel Vincent Reeves 2.3 miles through hostile terrain, and the first thing he became aware of was pain. Not the sharp, immediate pain of injury, but the deep, aching pain of muscles and joints that had been pushed far beyond their design limits and were now sending urgent messages about structural damage that would take weeks or months to fully heal if it healed at all. His lower back felt like someone had replaced his vertebrae with broken glass. His knees were swollen to the point where bending them more than a few degrees sent sharp protests through nerve endings that had experienced too much stress. His shoulders carried a persistent burning sensation that suggested tendons had been strained in ways that 68-year-old connective tissue was not designed to accommodate. Even breathing hurt, his ribcage protesting the expansion required for full inhalation after 2 days of shallow breathing, while his body focused on more critical repairs. But he was alive, and more importantly, the soldiers he had treated during the attack were alive, and Colonel Vincent Reeves was alive in a hospital at Bagram, where follow-up surgery had confirmed that the emergency laparotomy Caldwell had performed in the dust at FOB Sentinel had been exactly the intervention needed to save a life that would otherwise have been lost. Sergeant Laura Reeves sat beside his bed, her presence a surprise given that she should have been at Bagram with her father rather than back at FOB Sentinel, watching over the man she had spent 4 years hating. She noticed him wake and lean forward with an expression that carried complexity that could not be easily categorized. "Specialist Caldwell, welcome back. You have been sedated for 2 days while your body recovered from what the doctors are calling severe physical exhaustion, complicated by dehydration and musculoskeletal strain, consistent with carrying heavy loads over long distances at an age when such activity is medically inadvisable." Caldwell's throat was dry, his voice coming out as a rasp that required effort. "Your father?" Laura's expression softened slightly. "Alive because of you. He is at Bagram, recovering from additional surgery. The doctors there said your emergency repair work was some of the finest trauma surgery they had seen, especially considering you performed it with field equipment in a combat zone. He is going to make a full recovery." The relief that washed through Caldwell was profound enough that he had to close his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of successful outcome settle into bones that ached but had accomplished what they needed to accomplish. When he opened his eyes again, Laura was watching him with an intensity that suggested she had questions that went beyond simple medical updates. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "Something you need to know before the investigators arrive." "Investigators?" Laura nodded, her expression growing more serious. "Army Criminal Investigation Command. They arrived yesterday from Bagram. They are conducting a formal inquiry into the events surrounding the attack and its aftermath. Specifically, they are investigating allegations of fraudulent enlistment, unauthorized medical practice, and," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "negligent homicide." The last 2 words hit Caldwell with the force of a physical blow, and he struggled to sit up despite his body's protests. Negligent homicide of whom? The 35 soldiers who died during the attack before you revealed your surgical capabilities. Captain Hayes has provided testimony suggesting that you deliberately withheld medical care that could have saved lives, that you allowed soldiers to die while you maintained your cover as a simple combat medic. Caldwell absorbed this, understanding immediately what Hayes was attempting. The younger doctor was trying to shift responsibility for his own incompetent triage decisions onto Caldwell, to argue that if the old man had revealed himself sooner, then Hayes's mistakes would not have cost lives. It was a defensive strategy born of desperation, but it carried enough surface logic that investigators might find it compelling. How many soldiers actually died from preventable causes, Caldwell asked, though he already knew the answer because he had been counting each death as it happened. Laura consulted notes she had apparently prepared for this conversation. Based on my review of casualty reports and my observations during the attack, I estimate 12 deaths were directly attributable to Captain Hayes's incorrect triage protocols and treatment decisions. The other 23 died from injuries that would have been fatal regardless of intervention. But Hayes is arguing that all 35 could have been saved if you had taken command of medical operations from the beginning instead of waiting until my father was critically wounded. And what is your assessment, Sergeant? Laura met his eyes directly. My assessment is that Captain Derek Hayes is a coward trying to blame his failures on the man who exposed them. My assessment is that you saved approximately 60 soldiers who would have died under Hayes's care, including my father. My assessment is that the question of whether you should have revealed yourself sooner is complicated. But the fact that Hayes is the one making that accusation is obscene, given that he is responsible for my brother's death and has spent 4 years letting you take the blame. Before Caldwell could respond, the tent flap opened and 2 officers entered, wearing the distinctive insignia of Army Criminal Investigation Command. They were both lieutenant colonels, both carrying themselves with the kind of careful professionalism that suggested they took their investigative duties seriously and were not particularly interested in whether the subject of their investigation was sympathetic or not. Specialist Robert Caldwell, the senior investigator, said, his voice carrying no inflection that might suggest prejudgment. I am Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen, Army CID. This is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Williams. We need to ask you some questions regarding the events of November 15th at this location. Laura stood to leave, but Caldwell gestured for her to stay, wanting a witness to whatever was about to be discussed. The investigators did not object, and Lieutenant Colonel Chen pulled up a folding chair to sit across from Caldwell's bed, while his partner remained standing with a digital recorder. Specialist Caldwell, I need to advise you that this is a formal investigation that may result in criminal charges. You have the right to remain silent and to request legal counsel. Do you understand these rights? I understand, Caldwell said, but I do not require counsel. I will answer your questions. Chen nodded and began the methodical process of establishing facts. Can you confirm your current rank and assignment? Specialist E4, assigned to FOB Sentinel as combat medic for the past 9 months. And prior to your enlistment at age 66, what was your occupation? I was Chief of Trauma Surgery at Walter Reed Army Medical Center until my retirement 4 years ago. Chen's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes that suggested this confirmation was significant. So you enlisted in the United States Army with extensive medical credentials that you did not disclose on your enlistment paperwork. Is that correct? That is correct. I enlisted as a combat medic. My prior medical experience was not relevant to that position. The investigator made a note. We will return to that point. Can you describe the events of November 15th, beginning at 0647 hours when the first explosion occurred? Caldwell walked them through the timeline, describing the coordinated attack, the mass casualty situation, Captain Hayes's incorrect triage protocols, the deaths that accumulated while Hayes made decisions based on inadequate understanding of battlefield trauma medicine. He explained his choice to maintain his cover while soldiers died from treatable injuries, acknowledged that revealing his capabilities earlier would have saved lives, but also noted that Hayes's testimony was attempting to shift blame for command decisions that had been Hayes's responsibility. Lieutenant Colonel Williams spoke for the first time, her voice carrying a sharp edge. Specialists, you are telling us that you watched soldiers die from medical errors that you could have prevented, and you did nothing because you were hiding your true qualifications. Is that an accurate summary? Caldwell met her eyes steadily. That is accurate. I made the choice to follow the chain of command and defer to Captain Hayes as the senior medical officer, even when I believed his decisions were wrong. I own that choice and its consequences. And why did you finally choose to reveal yourself when Colonel Reeves was wounded? Because I had reached the point where following orders mattered less than saving a life that I knew I could save. Because watching more soldiers die when I had the skills to help them became intolerable. Because I was tired of hiding. Chen consulted his notes. Captain Hayes has testified that you have a history of taking responsibility for medical errors that were not yours. He states that 4 years ago you accepted blame for a surgical death at Walter Reed that was actually caused by his mistakes. Can you explain why we should believe that your current account of events is accurate when you have a documented history of accepting false blame? It was a fair question, and Caldwell had known it would come, because 4 years ago I had something to protect. I believed that covering for Captain Hayes would preserve his career and allow him to become the surgeon I thought he could be. I was wrong about that, but I genuinely believed it at the time. Now I have nothing to protect except the truth. The investigation continued for 2 hours, Chen and Williams systematically working through every detail of the attack and its aftermath. They questioned Caldwell about his decision to carry Colonel Reeves, about his medical treatment of other casualties after revealing himself, about the confrontation with Hayes that had exposed the truth about Captain Daniel Reeves's death 4 years earlier. Finally, Chen closed his notebook and stood. Specialist Caldwell, based on our preliminary investigation, we are considering charges of fraudulent enlistment for failing to disclose your medical credentials, insubordination for relieving a superior officer without authority, and negligent homicide for the soldiers who died before you chose to intervene. Do you have anything else to say at this time? Caldwell looked at the two investigators and recognized in their faces the expression of people who were doing a job that required them to set aside personal feelings in favor of institutional protocols. They were not enemies. They were professionals trying to determine whether the system had been violated in ways that required accountability. Only that I understand why you have to investigate these charges, and I accept whatever consequences the Army determines are appropriate. I did violate enlistment protocols. I did relieve a superior officer, and soldiers did die before I intervened. Those are facts. The only thing I can say in my defense is that I also saved lives. Whether that balances the scales is not for me to decide. The investigators left, and Laura remained sitting beside Caldwell's bed in silence that stretched until she finally spoke. They are going to court-martial you. Hayes has been building a case since the attack, getting statements from soldiers, creating a narrative where he is the overwhelmed doctor, trying his best, and you are the reckless old man who let people die. He is trying to save his career by destroying yours. Caldwell almost smiled at the irony. I already destroyed my career 4 years ago when I took the blame for his mistake. He cannot take what I already gave away. But this is different. This is not just reputation. This is prison time if they convict you of negligent homicide. This is dishonorable discharge. This is the end of everything. The end already happened, Sergeant. This is just the paperwork catching up. Over the next 3 days, the investigation expanded to include testimony from dozens of soldiers who had witnessed the attack and its aftermath. Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell was interviewed extensively, providing a detailed account of watching his father perform emergency surgery on Colonel Reeves and then carry the 210-pound patient over 2 miles of rough terrain. His testimony was measured and factual, neither defending nor condemning his father, but simply describing what he had observed. The soldiers who Caldwell had treated provided their own accounts, and their testimonies began to create a picture that was more complex than the simple narrative Hayes was trying to construct. Yes, Specialist Caldwell had hidden his capabilities for 9 months. Yes, soldiers had died before he revealed himself. But once he had taken command of medical operations, the death count had stopped rising. Soldiers who had been declared unsavable by Captain Hayes had survived because an old man with trembling legs and steady hands had refused to accept that age meant inability. Master Sergeant Cole Martinez gave particularly powerful testimony about watching Caldwell work during the crisis, describing the surgeon's calm competence under pressure and contrasting it with Hayes's visible panic and poor decision-making. Martinez was a 30-year veteran who had seen combat in 3 different conflicts, and his assessment carried weight that Hayes's self-serving accusations could not overcome. But the most significant testimony came on the 4th day of the investigation, when Colonel Vincent Reeves, transported back from Bagram specifically for this purpose, appeared via video conference from his hospital bed to provide his account of events. Reeves looked pale and weakened from his injuries and subsequent surgeries, but his voice was steady and his eyes carried the same intensity Caldwell remembered from their conversation the night before the attack. The investigators had set up a large monitor in a conference room at Forward Sentinel, and half the base seemed to have found reasons to be nearby when the colonel's testimony began. "I need to state for the record," Reeves said without preamble, "that I personally arranged for Specialist Robert Caldwell's enlistment in the United States Army. I used my position and connections to bypass normal age restrictions because I wanted to test whether Dr. Caldwell was the man who had saved my life 20 years ago, or whether he was the coward who had let my son die at Walter Reed." The investigators leaned forward, and Caldwell could see Lieutenant Colonel Chen making rapid notes. "I assigned him to my FOB," Reeves continued. "I observed him for 9 months. I watched him accept abuse from my daughter, who blamed him for her brother's death. I watched him take orders from Captain Hayes, who owed him everything. I watched him run with soldiers half his age and never complain when they mocked him for being too old. And what I learned is that age is not about the number of years you have lived. It is about what you have learned during those years and whether you still have the courage to use that knowledge when it matters most." Colonel Reeves paused, and his next words carried weight that demanded attention. "Dr. Robert Caldwell saved my life twice. Once 20 years ago in a field hospital during the Gulf War, when I was a young captain with shrapnel in my spine, and once 4 days ago when he performed emergency trauma surgery in conditions that would challenge surgeons half his age, then carried me 2.3 miles through hostile territory because waiting for a secure evacuation would have meant my death." He stopped again, collecting his thoughts, and when he spoke next, his voice carried something that sounded like anger, barely controlled. "The Army is investigating whether Dr. Caldwell is too old to serve, whether his age made him a liability, whether mandatory retirement exists for good reasons. I'm here to tell you that those questions are based on prejudice rather than evidence. Robert Caldwell, who at 68 performed battlefield surgery that saved my life and the lives of approximately 60 other soldiers. He carried 210 pounds over 2 miles in terrain and conditions that would break most soldiers half his age. His hands never trembled. His judgment never wavered. His courage never faltered." Reeves's expression hardened. "The question is not whether Dr. Caldwell's too old to serve. The question is whether this Army is wise enough to recognize that experience is an advantage rather than a liability, that age brings wisdom rather than weakness, and that the best surgeons are not always the youngest ones." The testimony concluded, but its impact continued to reverberate through the investigation. The narrative that Hayes had been trying to construct of an old man whose declining abilities had endangered soldiers could not survive the reality of what Reeves had described. The evidence was too clear. The outcomes were too definitive. But then the prosecution introduced new evidence that changed everything. Lieutenant Colonel Chen called Caldwell back for questioning on the 6th day of the investigation, and his expression suggested that something significant had developed. The conference room where they conducted interviews was spare and institutional, metal folding chairs and a table scarred with the marks of previous occupants, and the single light fixture overhead cast harsh shadows that made everyone look older and more tired than they probably were. "Specialist Caldwell," Chen began, arranging documents on the table with methodical care, "we have received documentation from Walter Reed Army Medical Center regarding your retirement 4 years ago. The official file states that you were required to retire not solely because of age, but because you were showing signs of declining surgical performance." He slid a set of medical evaluation forms across the table, and Caldwell recognized them immediately. The quarterly performance reviews that every senior surgeon underwent, the objective measurements of surgical outcomes and complication rates, the subjective assessments from colleagues and supervisors. His final reviews before retirement had shown a pattern that could not be denied. "Specifically," Chen continued, "the medical board noted that your hands trembled during procedures, not constantly, but frequently enough that colleagues reported concern. They documented instances where you required multiple attempts to place sutures that should have been routine. They noted that your decision-making during complex cases had slowed, that you were taking longer to assess situations and commit to treatment plans." Lieutenant Colonel Williams leaned forward, adding her own observation. "The board's final recommendation states, and I quote, Dr. Caldwell's performance has declined to the point where patient safety may be compromised. While his knowledge and experience remain valuable, the physical manifestations of age-related deterioration require that he be separated from active surgical duty. That does not sound like someone who should have been enlisting in combat service 3 years later. Caldwell looked at the documents, remembering the fear he had felt when the tremors had started, the humiliation of having colleagues notice something he had been trying to hide, the terrible understanding that his body was betraying the skills he had spent 3 decades perfecting. The medical board had been correct in their observations. The tremors had been real. The slowed decision-making had been measurable. The tremors were real, Caldwell said quietly, meeting Williams's skeptical gaze. 4 years ago, my hands shook during surgeries. My decisions were slower than they should have been. The medical board was absolutely correct in their observations and appropriate in their conclusions based on the information they had. Chen made a note. Then help me understand something, specialist. How do you explain the fact that multiple witnesses at FOB Sentinel, including trained medical personnel, describe your surgical performance as flawless? Sergeant Reeves, who assisted you during the operation on her father, states that your hands never trembled once during 90 minutes of complex trauma surgery. Lieutenant Caldwell, your own son, describes watching you work and seeing none of the physical deterioration that the Walter Reed Medical Board documented. Williams added her own pointed question. Are you claiming that age-related tremors and cognitive slowing simply disappeared between your forced retirement and your enlistment? That somehow getting 3 years older reversed symptoms that were severe enough to end your surgical career? Caldwell took a careful breath, understanding that his answer to these questions would determine not just the outcome of his court-martial, but potentially the Army's entire approach to age-based retirement policies. The words he chose now would either validate the institutional bias that equated age with decline, or they would challenge assumptions that had been accepted as medical fact for decades. No, I am not claiming that age-related deterioration reversed itself. What I am telling you is that the tremors and cognitive slowing were never caused by age in the first place. They were caused by psychological trauma that manifested as physical symptoms. Williams's expression sharpened. Psychological trauma from what exactly? From carrying responsibility for a patient death that was not my fault. From making the choice to destroy my career to protect Captain Derek Hayes. From spending every day knowing that I had let an innocent person die while the guilty party walked free. From lying to an inquiry board and watching my reputation destroyed while being unable to defend myself without exposing the truth I had chosen to hide. Caldwell's voice remained steady, but the emotion behind it was building. Do you know what it does to a surgeon to lose a patient on the table? To have someone die under your hands despite everything you know and everything you try? It creates a doubt that infects every subsequent decision. You second-guess yourself. You hesitate. You wonder if your judgment is still reliable, or if the next patient will die because you missed something or acted too slowly. He paused, gathering thoughts that had been suppressed for 4 years. Now imagine that doubt compounded by the knowledge that the death was not even your fault, that you are carrying blame for someone else's error, that you are lying to protect a person who does not deserve protection. That creates a psychological burden that the human body expresses through physical symptoms, tremors, slowed reactions. The manifestation of guilt and self-doubt in ways that look exactly like age-related decline. Chen was listening intently now, his skepticism shifting towards something that might have been interest. And when you enlisted? When I enlisted, the burden changed. I was no longer chief of trauma surgery at Walter Reed, responsible for entire departments in hundreds of patients and a reputation that I had destroyed. I was Specialist Caldwell, a combat medic whose job was to treat one soldier at a time with skills that nobody expected me to possess. The pressure that had created the tremors lifted. The psychological weight that had manifested as physical symptoms was replaced by a different kind of stress. The simple, clean stress of physical labor and following orders and being useful without carrying the crushing responsibility of surgical leadership. And the tremors stopped completely. My hands steadied within weeks of beginning basic training. My decision-making speed returned to normal. The symptoms that the medical board had documented as evidence of age-related deterioration vanished for them because they had never been related to age at all. They were the physical expression of unresolved trauma, and when the source of that trauma changed, the symptoms resolved. Williams was not entirely convinced. her legal training making her skeptical of explanations that could not be objectively verified. But you are asking this investigation to accept that career-ending medical symptoms were actually psychological, that they disappeared when you changed circumstances, and that therefore your fraudulent enlistment should be excused because the medical condition that should have disqualified you was not actually real. Caldwell met her eyes directly. No, I am asking you to consider that the human body responds to psychological stress in ways that can be mistaken for age-related decline, and that medical boards making decisions about mandatory retirement may be operating on incomplete information and institutional biases that serve administrative convenience rather than actual medical necessity. The silence that followed was heavy with implications both men recognized. If Caldwell was correct, if his tremors had been caused by trauma rather than age, then the entire system of mandatory retirement based on physical symptoms might need to be reconsidered. But if he was wrong, if he was simply making excuses for fraudulent enlistment, then the system had worked exactly as designed by identifying a surgeon whose deteriorating performance required separation from active duty. Chen closed his notebook with a gesture that suggested this line of questioning had gone as far as it could go. We will need independent medical verification of your claims, specialist. The court-martial will hear from experts who can assess whether your explanation is medically plausible or simply convenient storytelling. I understand, Caldwell said, and I welcome that assessment because the truth is important even when it is complicated. The investigation had reached its critical point, and Caldwell understood that what happened next would determine whether his actions at FOB Sentinel would be remembered as heroism or recklessness. The evidence was complicated. The facts supported multiple interpretations, and the institutional bias toward believing that age meant decline rather than experience was powerful enough that overcoming it would require more than just his testimony. The formal court-martial proceedings began 10 days after the attack, held in a temporary courtroom established at Bagram Airfield because FOB Sentinel lacked the facilities for legal proceedings of this magnitude. Caldwell was transported under guard, though the guards treated him with a respect that suggested they were uncertain whether they were escorting a criminal or a hero. The charges were read with military formality: fraudulent enlistment for failing to disclose material medical history, insubordination for relieving a superior officer without proper authority, and 35 counts of negligent homicide for deaths that occurred before Caldwell chose to intervene medically. The prosecution was led by a major who looked young enough to be Caldwell's grandson and who approached the case with the aggressive confidence of someone who believed the facts clearly supported conviction. His opening statement was precise and damning. The evidence will show that Specialist Robert Caldwell deliberately concealed his medical credentials when enlisting in the United States Army, that he maintained this deception for 9 months while serving at FOB Sentinel, that during a mass casualty event, he watched soldiers die from treatable injuries while refusing to use his surgical skills because revealing those skills would expose his fraudulent enlistment, that he only chose to act when a senior officer was wounded, suggesting that rank mattered more to him than the lives of enlisted soldiers. The prosecution will prove that Specialist Caldwell's actions constitute not heroism, but reckless endangerment motivated by self-interest and enabled by institutional failure to properly screen elderly applicants for military service. The defense attorney, a captain with a quiet intensity that suggested deeper competence than his junior rank might imply, took a different approach. The evidence will show that Dr. Robert Caldwell is one of the finest trauma surgeons this country has produced, that he saved approximately 60 soldiers during the attack on FOB Sentinel, including the base commander, whose testimony you will hear, that he carried a critically wounded patient over 2 miles of hostile terrain at age 68, an act of physical courage and endurance that would challenge soldiers half his age, that the question before this court is not whether Dr. Caldwell violated technical regulations, but whether those regulations serve their intended purpose of protecting soldier welfare, or whether they represent institutional prejudice that equates age with inability. The first witnesses were soldiers who had been present during the attack, and their testimonies painted a picture of chaos and desperation that no amount of legal formality could sanitize. They described the explosions that had torn through FOB Sentinel in the early morning, the screaming of wounded men trapped under rubble, the overwhelming sense that the medical system was collapsing under the weight of casualties it had never been designed to handle. Private First Class Marcus Johnson, 19 years old with a face that still carried the softness of recent adolescence, described being pulled from the collapsed barracks with a compound fracture of his femur and watching Captain Hayes declare him a low-priority case because the injury, while dramatic, was not immediately life-threatening. Johnson had lain in the dust for 3 hours, his pain increasing and his condition deteriorating, until Specialist Caldwell had examined him and immediately recognized signs of compartment syndrome that would have cost Johnson his leg if treatment had been delayed another hour. Captain Hayes said I could wait, Johnson testified, his voice still carrying the echo of pain remembered. He said other soldiers needed help more than I did, but Specialist Caldwell took one look at my leg and knew something was seriously wrong. He performed an emergency procedure right there in the field, and the doctors at Bagram told me later that if he had not done it when he did, they would have had to amputate. The prosecution tried to redirect. Private Johnson, are you aware that Specialist Caldwell had extensive surgical training that he deliberately concealed from his superiors? Johnson looked confused by the question. Sir, I do not care what paperwork he did or did not file. I care that I still have my leg because an old man knew more about medicine than the doctor who was supposed to be in charge. Then came the testimony about Captain Derek Hayes' performance during the crisis, and the courtroom grew progressively quieter as soldier after soldier described specific instances of Hayes' failures. Staff Sergeant William Chen described watching Hayes attempt to intubate a soldier with severe facial trauma, the younger doctor's hands shaking so badly that he required 3 attempts to secure an airway that should have taken 30 seconds. Corporal Rebecca Martinez described Hayes prescribing the wrong dosage of pain medication, an error that Caldwell had caught and corrected before it could harm the patient. Sergeant First Class David Thompson, a combat veteran with 15 years of service, provided perhaps the most damning testimony about Hayes' state during the crisis. Captain Hayes was panicking, Thompson said bluntly. I have seen officers under fire before. I know what command stress looks like. This was different. He was making decisions based on fear rather than medical judgment. He was prioritizing cases that looked dramatic over cases that were actually critical. And when soldiers started dying because of his mistakes, he started making more mistakes because he was too scared to think clearly. The prosecution objected. Sergeant Thompson, you are not qualified to assess medical decision-making. Thompson's response was delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his opinions through hard experience. Sir, I may not be a doctor, but I know the difference between a medic who is saving lives and one who is watching them die. Captain Hayes was watching them die. Specialist Caldwell was saving them. That is the only qualification I need. The cumulative effect of these testimonies was devastating to the prosecution's narrative. Yes, Caldwell had hidden his capabilities. Yes, he had maintained his deception while soldiers died. But the soldiers themselves were testifying that Hayes' incompetence, not Caldwell's silence, had been the primary cause of preventable deaths. The prosecution tried to redirect by arguing that Hayes' failures did not excuse Caldwell's choice to remain hidden, but the jury's expressions suggested that this argument was not landing with the force the prosecutors had hoped. Then came testimony from the soldiers Caldwell had saved after revealing himself, and their accounts created a counter-narrative that was difficult to dismiss. 15 soldiers took the stand over 2 days, each describing injuries that Captain Hayes had declared untreatable or low priority, and each explaining how Specialist Caldwell had assessed their condition with a glance and implemented treatment that had saved their lives. Specialist Amanda Rodriguez described being trapped under rubble with a penetrating chest wound that was causing a tension pneumothorax, a condition that would have killed her within minutes if not properly treated. Captain Hayes had examined her briefly, declared that extracting her from the rubble would take too long, given other priorities, and moved on to other casualties. Caldwell had arrived 30 minutes later, performed a needle decompression to relieve the pressure on her lung, and supervised her extraction with a level of medical precision that had allowed her to survive injuries that should have been fatal. I heard Captain Hayes tell someone I was not going to make it, Rodriguez testified, her voice steady, but her hands gripping the witness stand hard enough to show white knuckles. I heard him say that resources should go to soldiers with better chances. And then this old man appeared, looked at me for maybe 10 seconds, and did something with a needle that let me breathe again. He saved my life in less time than it took Captain Hayes to decide I was not worth saving. Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell took the stand on the 3rd day, And his testimony carried the careful balance of a son trying to be honest about a father he was still learning to understand. He described watching Caldwell perform emergency surgery with hands that never trembled despite extreme circumstances. He described the 2-mile journey carrying Colonel Reeves, watching his father's body reach its limits and continue beyond them through pure determination. He described reaching a new understanding of why surgery had consumed so much of his father's life. "My father saved 60 lives during that attack," Nathan said, his voice steady. He performed surgery that military doctors at Bagram later described as exceptional. He carried a 210-pound man over rough terrain at age 68. If those actions constitute the behavior of someone too old to serve, then we need to reconsider what we mean by capability. But the most powerful testimony came from Colonel Vincent Reeves himself, transported from his hospital bed to appear in person because he had insisted that some things needed to be said face to face. Reeves entered the courtroom in a wheelchair, his injuries still healing, but his presence commanding immediate attention. "I arranged for Dr. Caldwell's enlistment," Reeves said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "I used my position to bypass age restrictions because I wanted to test his character. I spent 9 months observing him, judging him, making his life difficult. What I learned is that age is not the liability we pretend it is. Dr. Caldwell at 68 outperformed doctors half his age. His experience, his judgment, his ability to remain calm under pressure. These are advantages that only come with time." Reeves paused, and his next words carried weight that demanded attention. "This court-martial is based on the assumption that mandatory retirement serves soldier welfare. But I am alive today because a man who this Army said was too old to serve refused to accept that judgment. 60 other soldiers are alive for the same reason. The question is not whether Dr. Caldwell violated regulations. The question is whether those regulations are based on evidence or prejudice." The prosecution's rebuttal focused on the 35 soldiers who had died before Caldwell revealed himself, arguing that his delay had cost lives regardless of how many he later saved. The major prosecuting made the point repeatedly, using the names of the dead to create emotional impact that pure argument could not achieve. Private First Class James Cooper, 20 years old, died from a treatable chest wound because Specialist Caldwell chose to hide his skills. Sergeant Michael Torres, 27 years old, died from internal bleeding that Dr. Caldwell could have stopped. Corporal David Kim, 23 years old, died because an old man decided that protecting his secret was more important than saving lives. It was effective prosecution, and Caldwell sat through the recitation of names feeling the weight of each death settle onto shoulders that still ached from carrying Colonel Reeves. The major was correct. Those soldiers had died while Caldwell maintained his cover. That was truth that no amount of justification could erase. Then the defense called its final witness, and Sergeant Laura Reeves took the stand with an expression that suggested she had things to say that would not be comfortable for anyone to hear. "The prosecution wants you to believe that my father is alive because Specialist Caldwell chose to reveal himself when a senior officer was wounded," Laura said, her voice steady but carrying an edge. "That narrative suggests rank mattered more to him than enlisted lives. But that is not what happened. Specialist Caldwell revealed himself because I begged him to, because I stood there watching my father die, and I asked him directly whether he could save him or not. He made the choice to end his deception, not because of rank, but because someone finally asked him to stop hiding." She paused, and her next words were directed not at the court, but at Caldwell himself. "I spent 4 years hating Specialist Caldwell for something he did not do. I blamed him for my brother's death when Captain Hayes was responsible. I made his life at FOB Sentinel as difficult as I could because I thought he deserved punishment. And when 200 soldiers were wounded and Captain Hayes was failing and people were dying, I was the one who told him to follow orders and maintain his cover." Laura's voice grew harder. "So if you are going to charge someone with negligent homicide for those 35 deaths, you should charge me too, because I am the one who told him to stay silent. I am the one who reinforced his belief that hiding was appropriate. And when he finally did reveal himself and save my father and 60 other soldiers, I was the one who benefited most from his choice to stop obeying people like me who did not deserve his obedience." The courtroom was silent when Laura finished, and even the prosecution seemed uncertain how to respond to testimony that complicated their narrative in ways that legal argument could not easily address. The verdict came 3 days later, delivered by a military judge who had spent those days reviewing evidence in testimony and precedent. The courtroom was packed with soldiers from FOB Sentinel who had traveled to Bagram specifically to hear the judgment, and the tension was palpable as the judge prepared to speak. On the charge of fraudulent enlistment, I find the accused guilty. Specialist Caldwell deliberately concealed material medical history during his enlistment process, and regardless of his motivations, this constitutes a violation of military regulations. Caldwell felt the weight of that verdict, but was not surprised by it. The facts were clear. He had hidden his credentials. That was not in dispute. On the charge of insubordination, the judge continued, I find the accused not guilty. The evidence shows that Captain Hayes was demonstrably failing in his duties as senior medical officer, that soldiers were dying from his incompetent decisions, and that Specialist Caldwell's intervention was necessary to prevent further loss of life. Military discipline requires obedience to lawful orders, but it does not require soldiers to follow orders that they know will result in unnecessary deaths. The courtroom stirred, and Caldwell saw relief on faces that had been tight with worry. On the 35 counts of negligent homicide, the judge paused, and the silence that followed was absolute. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, I find the accused not guilty. The deaths in question were primarily caused by Captain Hayes's inadequate triage decisions and the overwhelming nature of the mass casualty event. While Specialist Caldwell's earlier intervention might have saved additional lives, the evidence does not support a finding that his delay constituted criminal negligence. A soldier is entitled to follow the chain of command unless doing so clearly endangers lives, and the point at which that threshold was crossed is a matter of judgment rather than criminal culpability. The judge looked at Caldwell with an expression that suggested personal conflict between legal findings and institutional concerns. However, the charge of fraudulent enlistment carries serious consequences. Specialist Caldwell will be separated from the Army with a general discharge under honorable conditions. His service record will reflect both his technical violations and his extraordinary performance during the crisis at FOB Sentinel. It was over. Caldwell was being discharged, sent home with a status that was neither fully honorable nor dishonorable, but somewhere in between, a middle ground that reflected the complexity of what he had done and why he had done it. But before the proceedings could formally conclude, the judge added one final comment. This court also recommends that the Army Medical Command conduct a comprehensive review of mandatory retirement policies to determine whether age-based separation serves military readiness or whether it represents institutional bias that deprives the service of experienced personnel. The evidence presented in this case suggests that conventional assumptions about age and capability may not reflect actual performance outcomes. After the verdict, Caldwell stood outside the courtroom, watching the sun set over the Afghan mountains, and feeling the complicated mix of relief and loss that came from having the matter resolved in a way that was neither triumph nor tragedy, but something more ambiguous. He had not been convicted of killing soldiers through negligence. He had not been dishonorably discharged. But he had also not been vindicated, not been told that his choices had been correct and his service valuable. Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell found him there as darkness began to settle, and father and son stood together in silence that had become easier over the days since the attack. "What will you do now?" Nathan asked. Caldwell considered the question. The Army had offered him nothing. Walter Reed had made no contact. His career as a surgeon was over. His career as a soldier ended before it had really begun. But he was 68 years old, and he had proven something to himself that was worth more than rank or recognition. "I think I will teach," Caldwell said. "There is an Army medical school that trains combat medics. I suspect they could use someone who understands battlefield trauma and is willing to share what he has learned." Nathan nodded slowly. "That sounds right. Teaching the next generation, making sure they do not have to learn everything through mistakes." They stood together as full darkness fell, and somewhere in the distance, another helicopter lifted into the Afghan night, carrying soldiers to and from places where people needed saving. And Robert Caldwell understood that he had finally found the answer to a question he had been asking for 4 years. He had been looking for redemption through punishment, for balance through suffering, for absolution through sacrifice. But redemption did not work that way. It came not from accepting blame for mistakes that were not yours, but from using your skills when they mattered most, regardless of personal cost. He had saved 60 lives. He had carried a wounded man 2 miles when his body had every reason to quit. He had proven that 68 years old meant experience rather than obsolescence. And tomorrow, he would begin teaching others to do the same. The letter from Walter Reed Army Medical Center arrived 3 weeks after Robert Caldwell's court-martial concluded, delivered to the temporary quarters at Bagram Airfield, where he was waiting for transport back to the United States, and whatever future awaited a 68-year-old former trauma surgeon with a general discharge and a complicated service record that defied easy categorization. The envelope was heavy stock paper with the hospital's official letterhead embossed in gold, the kind of formal correspondence that institutions used when they wanted to convey significance and authority. Caldwell opened it carefully, his hands still carrying residual stiffness from the physical trauma of carrying Colonel Vincent Reeves 2.3 miles over rough terrain, and read words that 4 years ago would have represented the vindication he had believed impossible to achieve. Dr. Robert Caldwell, the letter began, and the use of his former title rather than his military rank suggested the hospital's position before he read further. The board of directors and medical staff of Walter Reed Army Medical Center wish to extend our sincere apologies for the circumstances surrounding your departure from our institution 4 years ago. Recent revelations regarding the death of Captain Daniel Reeves have clarified that our conclusions about your role in that tragedy were based on incomplete information provided by individuals who have since been discredited. Caldwell paused, absorbing the careful language that acknowledged error without quite admitting institutional failure. The letter continued for 2 pages, detailing the hospital's review of his case, their understanding that he had accepted blame for errors committed by Captain Derek Hayes, their recognition that his forced retirement had been based on symptoms that were psychological rather than age-related, and finally their offer. We would like to offer you reinstatement to your former position as Chief of Trauma Surgery with full back pay for the 4 years of your separation, a public acknowledgement of our error, and a salary package reflecting both your experience and our institutional commitment to making this matter right. The position would include all benefits and privileges you held prior to your retirement, along with a formal letter of apology to be placed in your permanent record and made available to any institution that might question your credentials or performance. It was everything Caldwell had lost 4 years ago being offered back to him, as if time could be reversed and mistakes undone through institutional generosity. Chief of Surgery, full salary, which the letter specified as $450,000 annually. Public vindication, the restoration of a reputation that had been destroyed when he made the choice to protect Derek Hayes at the cost of his own career. Caldwell read the letter twice, then set it aside and walked to the window of his quarters to watch the sun setting over the Afghan mountains, painting the peaks in shades of amber and purple that would have been beautiful if he had the emotional capacity to appreciate beauty while processing what the letter represented. 4 years ago, he would have done anything to receive this offer. He would have accepted immediately, grateful for the chance to return to the operating rooms where he had spent 3 decades perfecting his craft. But 4 years had changed him in ways that made the offer feel less like salvation and more like a misunderstanding of what he had learned about himself and what he needed from whatever years remained. The second letter arrived 2 days later, this one from the Pentagon, and Caldwell recognized the weight of official government correspondence before he opened the envelope. The letterhead identified the sender as the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the contents were both flattering and concerning in their implications. Dr. Caldwell, the letter began, your recent service at Forward Operating Base Sentinel and the subsequent legal proceedings have come to my attention. Your performance during the mass casualty event of November 15th demonstrates capabilities that this nation needs, particularly as we reassess our policies regarding age-based mandatory retirement in the armed services. The letter went on to describe a proposed position, a special appointment as Army Surgeon General with a rank equivalent to Lieutenant General, bypassing normal age restrictions through what the letter described as exceptional circumstances requiring exceptional measures. The role would involve leading a comprehensive review of military medical policies, developing new protocols for battlefield trauma care, and serving as a visible example that experience and wisdom could outweigh the conventional assumptions about aging and capability. It was a position of significant authority and influence, the kind of role that would let Caldwell shape military medicine for the next generation, while simultaneously vindicating his argument that mandatory retirement based on age represented institutional bias rather than medical necessity. The secretary's letter made it clear that Caldwell would have resources, authority, and a platform to prove that being 68 years old was an advantage rather than a liability. Caldwell set this letter aside as well and returned to watching the mountains, understanding that both offers represented versions of redemption that other people had decided he should want, but neither addressed what he had learned about himself during 9 months at FOB Sentinel and 4 days of carrying the weight of 210 pounds, plus the accumulated burden of 4 years of hiding who he was. The third letter was different. It came from Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, home of the Army Medical School, where combat medics learned the skills they would need to save lives in conditions that would challenge doctors working in fully equipped hospitals. The letterhead was simpler, the language less formal, and the offer carried a weight that the other two had not because it represented something Caldwell had not known he needed until he read the words on the page. Dr. Caldwell, we are writing to offer you a position as senior instructor in our combat medicine program. This role would involve teaching advanced battlefield trauma techniques to enlisted medics, developing curriculum based on your extensive experience in both hospital and combat settings, and serving as a mentor to the next generation of soldiers who will be responsible for saving lives in the most difficult conditions imaginable. The position would not carry significant rank or prestige. The salary would be a fraction of what Walter Reed was offering. There would be no authority to shape policy or influence institutional decisions about mandatory retirement. It was simply an opportunity to teach, to share what he had learned over 3 decades of trauma surgery and 9 months of being dismissed as too old to contribute, to ensure that the medics who would face future mass casualty events had the knowledge and skills to save lives that less experienced personnel might lose. Caldwell read this letter 3 times, and with each reading he felt something settle into place that the other 2 offers had not touched. This was what he needed, not vindication or authority or the restoration of what he had lost, but the chance to be useful in a way that mattered more than personal redemption. He wrote his responses that evening, 3 letters that would determine the shape of whatever years remained to him. To Walter Reed, he thanked them for their offer and their apology, but respectfully declined the position, noting that he had learned during his time away that being chief of surgery required sacrifices of family and personal life that he was no longer willing to make. To the Pentagon, he expressed appreciation for the confidence implied by their offer, but suggested that reforming age-based policies would be better served by promoting younger officers who had witnessed firsthand that experience could outweigh conventional assumptions about capability. To Fort Sam Houston, he accepted the position as senior instructor and requested assignment to begin as soon as his discharge from military service was finalized. Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell found his father in the temporary quarters at Bagram 2 days before Caldwell's scheduled transport back to the United States. And when Nathan entered the room, he was carrying an expression that suggested the visit was motivated by something more significant than simple filial obligation. Father and son had spoken several times since the court-martial concluded, conversations that were becoming progressively easier as the years of accumulated resentment slowly gave way to something that might eventually become understanding if given enough time. "Dad," Nathan said, settling into one of the folding chairs that constituted the room's only furniture beyond the narrow bed, "I received new orders this morning. I am being reassigned from FOB Sentinel, effective immediately." Caldwell looked at his son, seeing in Nathan's face the mix of emotions that suggested the reassignment was both wanted and complicated. "Where are they sending you?" "Fort Sam Houston. Security detail for the Army Medical School. It seems that someone with connections requested that I be assigned to the same location where you will be teaching. Someone who apparently believes that a father and son, who have spent 5 years barely speaking, might benefit from proximity that forces them to address the things they have been avoiding." Nathan's voice carried something between amusement and apprehension, and Caldwell recognized the emotional complexity of a situation that offered the possibility of reconciliation while also requiring both of them to confront failures that were easier to ignore from a distance. "I did not request that," Caldwell said quietly. "I would not presume to manipulate your career for my personal benefit. I know. Colonel Reeves did it. He called me from his hospital bed at Bagram to tell me that he had pulled strings to arrange my reassignment because, and I quote, sometimes people who are too stubborn to fix their relationships on their own need institutional intervention to force them into the same space until they figure out what matters." Caldwell almost smiled at that, recognizing Reeves's particular brand of aggressive mentoring that had led to his own enlistment in 9 months of testing whether he was a man of character or a coward hiding behind noble gestures. And how do you feel about this institutional intervention? Nathan was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that what he said next would shape the trajectory of their relationship going forward. When I watched you carry Colonel Reeves 2 miles through hostile territory at age 68, when I saw your body reaching its absolute limits and continuing beyond them because stopping meant accepting defeat, I understood something about you that I had not understood before. You were not choosing surgery over family all those years. You were choosing to be who you are fundamentally, a man who cannot walk away when lives need saving. He paused, and his next words carried the weight of emotions that had been building since his mother's death 5 years earlier. But understanding why you made those choices does not erase the cost of them. I still remember the soccer games you missed, the birthdays you forgot, the school events where other kids had both parents and I had just mom making excuses about why dad was at the hospital again. I remember being angry about that for so long that anger became the default setting for how I thought about you. Caldwell listened without interrupting, understanding that his son needed to say these things and that the only appropriate response was to hear them completely. What I am trying to say, Nathan continued, is that I do not know if I can fully forgive you yet for all the times you were not there. But I want to try. And maybe having us both at Fort Sam Houston is Colonel Reeves's way of giving us the opportunity to figure out whether forgiveness is possible, whether we can build something that looks like a real relationship instead of just the genetic connection that makes us father and son without any of the emotional substance that should come with those roles. It was the most honest conversation they had ever had, and Caldwell felt something in his chest that might have been hope mixing with the regret that never fully went away, regardless of how much understanding accumulated. I would like that, he said simply. I would like the chance to be your father instead of just the surgeon who happened to contribute DNA to your existence. I cannot promise I will be good at it because I have spent 68 years being better at surgery than at human relationships. But I would like to try. Nathan nodded, and in that gesture, Caldwell saw the beginning of something that might eventually become the bridge between them that had been broken for so long. They sat together in the temporary quarters, talking about practical matters, about Nathan's reassignment and Caldwell's teaching position and the logistics of both of them being in San Antonio. And the conversation was easier than any they had shared in years because it was built on honesty rather than the careful avoidance that had characterized their previous interactions. Sergeant Laura Reeves appeared at Bagram 3 days before Caldwell's departure, having traveled from her father's hospital room specifically to speak with the man she had spent 4 years hating and 4 weeks learning to understand. She found Caldwell in the medical facility where he had been volunteering his time treating minor injuries and illnesses for soldiers awaiting transport. And when she approached him, her expression carried the complexity of someone who had experienced a fundamental revision of their understanding of truth and responsibility. Specialist Caldwell, she said, formal despite the fact that his discharge meant the rank would soon be irrelevant, I need to talk to you about something that has been weighing on me since the court-martial concluded. Caldwell set down the medical chart he had been reviewing and gave her his full attention, recognizing in her tone that this conversation would be significant. What is on your mind, Sergeant? My father is being discharged from the hospital next week. He will need several months of rehabilitation, but the doctors say he will make a full recovery. He wants to visit my brother's grave at Arlington National Cemetery once he is able to travel, and he asked me to invite you to come with us. He said, and these are his words, that you have earned the right to say goodbye properly to the soldier whose death you have been carrying for 4 years. The invitation hit Caldwell with unexpected force, and he had to take a moment to process what Colonel Reeves was offering. A chance to visit Captain Daniel Reeves's grave, to acknowledge the death that had set in motion everything that followed, to speak words that had been unspoken for 4 years, because accepting blame for Hayes's error had required Caldwell to pretend he bore responsibility rather than just accountability. I would be honored, Caldwell said quietly. Thank you for extending the invitation. Laura nodded, but she was not finished. There is something else I need to say, and I need to say it now before I lose the courage. For 4 years, I hated you. I blamed you for taking my brother away from our family. I made your time at FOB Sentinel as difficult as I could because I believed you deserved punishment for what you had done. And every bit of that hatred was directed at the wrong person for the wrong reasons. Her voice remained steady, but Caldwell could hear the emotion beneath the professional composure. You saved my father's life. You saved 60 other soldiers. You performed surgery and carried a patient and proved that everything I believed about you was wrong. And I need you to know that I am sorry for the hatred, for making your life harder, for all of it. Caldwell looked at this young woman who had lost her brother to Derek Hayes's drunken error and had spent 4 years directing grief and anger at the person who had tried to save him. And he understood that forgiveness was not about erasing the past, but about choosing to move forward despite it. You do not need to apologize, Sergeant. You believed what you were told by people who should have been truthful. The fault was not yours. Laura shook her head. The fault was mine for not questioning, for not looking deeper, for accepting the simple answer that let me direct my anger at someone specific rather than accepting the more complicated truth. But I am trying to learn from that mistake. I am trying to understand that simple answers are usually wrong and that the truth is almost always more complex than we want it to be. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a question that suggested she had been thinking about this for some time. You are going to teach at Fort Sam Houston, teaching combat medics how to save lives in impossible conditions. I would like to apply to attend your courses. I would like to learn from someone who actually understands battlefield trauma instead of just following protocols written by people who have never experienced mass casualty events. Caldwell felt something that might have been pride mixing with the ongoing surprise at how the consequences of his choices at Forward Sentinel continued to unfold in unexpected ways. I would be honored to have you in my class, Sergeant Reeves. You have natural surgical talent. With proper training, you could be exceptional. They talked for another hour about Laura's plans, about her father's recovery, about the visit to Arlington that would happen in the coming months, and when she finally left Caldwell, sat alone in the medical facility, feeling the weight of reconciliation that was not complete, but was at least beginning to move in directions that suggested healing was possible, given enough time and honesty. The most difficult conversation came 2 days before Caldwell's departure, when Captain Derek Hayes requested a meeting through official channels, noting that he was currently confined pending his own court-martial, but that regulations allowed him to request meetings with other personnel provided appropriate security measures were in place. Caldwell almost declined the request but finally agreed because Hayes's message had included a sentence that suggested genuine motivation. I need to tell you something that you deserve to hear before I face the consequences of my actions. They met in a secured conference room with a guard stationed outside, and when Hayes entered, he looked like someone who had spent weeks confronting realities that could not be avoided. His face was thinner, his eyes carried exhaustion, and his voice when he spoke was stripped of the confident arrogance that had characterized their previous interactions. Thank you for agreeing to see me, Hayes said. I know you have no reason to grant me this meeting. Caldwell waited, saying nothing, letting Hayes work through whatever he had come to say. I have spent the last 3 weeks thinking about the attack, Hayes continued, about the soldiers who died because I panicked, about the fact that you saved lives I could not save, about all the ways I failed at the most basic requirement of being a doctor. He paused and his voice carried genuine remorse. But more than that, I have been thinking about 4 years ago, about Captain Miles dying because I was drunk and made a mistake, about you taking the blame to protect my career, about me accepting that protection and spending 4 years letting you carry a responsibility that was mine alone. Hayes met Caldwell's eyes. I told myself that you made the choice to take the blame, that I had not asked you to do it, but that was cowardice. I should have told the truth. I should have faced the consequences. I should have been the one whose career was destroyed instead of you. Why are you telling me this now? Caldwell asked quietly. Because I am going to prison, Hayes said simply. The court-martial will convict me. I will be dishonorably discharged. My medical license will be revoked. Everything I spent 12 years building will be taken away. The silence that followed was heavy. Hayes was not asking for forgiveness. He was simply acknowledging truth in a way he had not been capable of doing 4 years earlier. What will you do when you are released? Caldwell asked. Hayes shook his head. I do not know. I will not be able to practice medicine. I suppose I will have a lot of time in prison to think about options. Caldwell looked at the man who had been his protege and made a decision that was probably foolish but felt necessary. When you are released, if you still want to practice medicine, contact me at Fort Sam Houston. I cannot promise anything, but I might be able to help you find a path back. Not the surgeon you were, but perhaps something that lets you use your knowledge to help people." Hayes stared at him with an expression that suggested the offer was so unexpected he could not process it. "Why would you do that, after everything I have done?" Caldwell considered the question. "Because you were brilliant but broken, and I thought I could fix you by taking the blame. I was wrong. You cannot fix people who do not want to be fixed. But perhaps facing real consequences will break you in ways that lead to being rebuilt into someone better." He paused. "And perhaps teaching you again, if you still want to learn after you have paid for your mistakes, perhaps that will be my way of making sure that Captain Reeves's death leads to something other than more tragedy." Hayes had no response beyond a nod, and when the meeting concluded, Caldwell sat alone, understanding that redemption was not a single act but a process that continued across years. 6 months later, Robert Caldwell stood in a classroom at Fort Sam Houston Army Medical School, facing 40 combat medics whose ages ranged from 20 to 45, and whose experience levels varied from fresh out of basic training to seasoned veterans with multiple deployments. The room was standard military issue, plain walls and fluorescent lighting and desks arranged in rows. But the students themselves represented something more significant than simple institutional training. These were the men and women who would be responsible for saving lives in the next war, the next mass casualty event, the next impossible situation where the difference between soldiers living and dying would depend on whether the medics treating them had knowledge and skills that went beyond basic protocols. They were here to learn advanced battlefield trauma techniques, and Caldwell was here to teach them everything he had learned over 3 decades of trauma surgery and 9 months of being dismissed as too old to contribute. "Welcome to Advanced Combat Trauma Medicine," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had earned credibility through performance rather than rank. "I am Dr. Robert Caldwell, but you will call me Specialist Caldwell or just Specialist, because the rank I held in the Army reflects the humility that should accompany medical knowledge, rather than the pride that comes from believing credentials make you better than the soldiers you serve." He paused, letting the students process this introduction that was deliberately different from what they might have expected from someone teaching at their level. "I am 68 years old, and some of you are probably wondering whether someone my age can teach you anything relevant about combat medicine in modern warfare. That is a fair question. The Army certainly wondered the same thing when they initially rejected my enlistment because I was past the maximum age limit." A few students shifted in their seats, uncertain whether this was leading toward a point or just an old man rambling. But Caldwell continued with building purpose. "But what I learned over 9 months at Forward Operating Base Sentinel in Afghanistan is that age is not about the number of years you have lived. It is about what you have learned during those years and whether you still have the courage and capability to use that knowledge when it matters most." He moved from behind the podium to stand where students could see him fully, and his next words were delivered with intensity that demanded attention. "During a mass casualty event at FOB Sentinel, 217 soldiers were wounded in a coordinated attack. The senior medical officer panicked and made incorrect triage decisions that resulted in preventable deaths. I performed emergency trauma surgery under fire, stabilized approximately 60 casualties who would have died under inadequate care, and carried a critically wounded battalion commander 2.3 miles through hostile territory to reach an evacuation point." Caldwell let that information settle before continuing. "I did all of this at age 68, and my hands never trembled despite carrying extreme physical loads. My judgment never wavered despite overwhelming circumstances. My knowledge, accumulated over 3 decades of trauma surgery, allowed me to save lives that less experienced doctors could not save." He paused and his voice grew harder. "The military investigated whether I was too old to serve. They court-martialed me for fraudulent enlistment because I had not disclosed my full medical credentials. They questioned whether mandatory retirement policies exist for good reasons or whether they represent institutional prejudice that equates age with inability. And what the evidence showed is that experience is an advantage, not a liability, and that the best medical personnel are not always the youngest ones." Several students were leaning forward now, engaged in a way that suggested the introduction had accomplished its purpose of establishing that this course would be different from standard medical training. Caldwell saw the shift in attention and continued. "This course will teach you techniques that most combat medics never learn, because they are considered too advanced for enlisted personnel. You will learn how to perform emergency surgical procedures with field equipment. You will learn how to make triage decisions in mass casualty situations. You will learn how to save lives in conditions that would challenge doctors working in fully equipped hospitals. He moved back to the podium and pulled up the first slide of his presentation. But more importantly, you will learn that saving lives is not about following protocols written by people who have never experienced combat trauma. It is about understanding human physiology deeply enough that you can adapt to impossible circumstances and make decisions that balance ideal medical care against actual battlefield reality. The course was structured around case studies drawn from Caldwell's own experience. And over the following weeks, he walked the students through scenarios that forced them to confront the kind of decisions that could not be made by simply consulting field manuals or following standard procedures. He taught them how to recognize internal bleeding through palpation when diagnostic equipment was not available, how to perform emergency cricothyrotomy when airways were compromised, how to repair vascular injuries with instruments designed for basic field medicine rather than hospital surgery. But beyond technical skills, Caldwell taught them something more fundamental. He taught them that medical knowledge was not static, that the human body responded to trauma in ways that required constant reassessment and adaptation, that the difference between a good medic and an exceptional one was the willingness to trust accumulated knowledge over institutional protocols when the two came into conflict. Sergeant Laura Reeves was among his students, and Caldwell watched her progress with particular attention because he recognized in her the same natural surgical talent that had made Derek Hayes brilliant before alcohol and arrogance had corrupted his abilities. Laura learned quickly, her hands steady, and her judgment sound. And during practical exercises where students practiced procedures on simulation models, she demonstrated skills that exceeded what her training level should have produced. After one particularly complex exercise where Laura had successfully performed a simulated emergency thoracotomy, Caldwell pulled her aside for a private conversation. "Sergeant Reeves, you have surgical talent that is being wasted in a medic role. Have you considered applying to medical school?" Laura looked surprised by the question. "Sir, I am 28 years old with no pre-medical coursework and a service record that includes 4 years of blaming the wrong person for my brother's death. I do not think I am medical school material." Caldwell shook his head. "You are exactly medical school material. You have field experience that pre-med students lack. You have demonstrated ability to perform under pressure. And you have learned that making mistakes and correcting them is more valuable than never making mistakes in the first place. If you apply, I will write you a recommendation that will make admissions committees understand that age and unconventional backgrounds can produce exceptional doctors." Laura absorbed this, and Caldwell could see her processing the possibility of a future she had not considered. "I will think about it," she said finally, "and thank you for seeing potential that I did not see in myself." It was a conversation that repeated itself with variations throughout the semester, as Caldwell identified students whose abilities suggested they could contribute more to military medicine than their current roles allowed. He wrote recommendations, made phone calls to colleagues at medical schools and physician assistant programs, and opened doors for soldiers who had believed that their backgrounds or ages or unconventional paths disqualified them from advanced medical careers. Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell attended several of his father's lectures as part of his duties, providing security for the medical school, and after one class where Caldwell had described the process of carrying Colonel Reeves 2 miles while monitoring vital signs and adjusting treatment during movement, Nathan approached with an expression that suggested the lecture had affected him more than casual observation would explain. "Dad," Nathan said quietly, "watching you teach is helping me understand something I could not understand before. You were not absent during my childhood because you did not care about me. You were absent because teaching and healing and saving lives is what you are designed to do at a fundamental level. It is not a choice between family and career. It is who you are." Caldwell looked at his son, seeing in Nathan's face the ongoing process of reconciliation that was not complete, but was progressing in ways that suggested real relationship might eventually replace the genetic connection that had been their only bond for so long. "I wish I had understood that distinction when you were young," Caldwell said. "I wish I had found a way to be both the surgeon and the father instead of believing I had to choose." Nathan nodded slowly. "I wish you had too. But I am learning that understanding why people make the choices they make is different from forgiving those choices, and forgiveness is different from rebuilding trust. We are somewhere in the middle of that process, and I think that is okay. We do not have to be perfect at this. We just have to keep trying. It was the most mature assessment of their relationship that either had articulated, and it felt like progress in ways that simple reconciliation would not have, because it acknowledged the reality that some damage took time to heal and some relationships had to be rebuilt slowly rather than restored instantly. The visit to Arlington National Cemetery happened on a cold morning in March, 7 months after the attack at Forward Base Sentinel, and 5 months after Caldwell had begun teaching at Fort Sam Houston. Colonel Vincent Reeves was walking with a cane, but without the wheelchair that had been necessary during his initial recovery, and Sergeant Laura Reeves accompanied him along with Robert Caldwell and Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell in a small group that represented the complicated web of connections that Captain Daniel Reeves's death had created 4 years earlier. They walked through the rows of white headstones that marked soldiers who had given their lives in service to their country, and when they reached Captain Reeves's grave, Colonel Reeves stood in silence for several minutes before speaking. "My son was 24 years old when he died," Colonel Reeves said, his voice steady, but carrying undertones of grief that 4 years had not fully resolved. He had a wife and a daughter he never met. He had plans for after his deployment, college on the GI Bill, maybe teaching history because he had always been good at making the past feel relevant to the present. The colonel paused, and Laura moved closer to stand beside her father in a gesture of support that suggested their relationship had been strengthened rather than broken by the revelations about her brother's death. "For 4 years, I blamed Dr. Caldwell for taking Daniel away from us. I arranged his enlistment so I could test whether he was a coward or a man of honor. I made his life difficult because I wanted him to suffer the way our family had suffered." Reeves turned to look at Caldwell directly. "What I learned is that you were neither a coward nor simply a man of honor. You were a doctor who made a choice to protect someone else at the cost of your own career. And while that choice had consequences you did not anticipate, it came from a place of genuine care for a protege you had trained and mentored." He stopped, collecting thoughts that were clearly difficult to articulate. Daniel's death was a tragedy, and Captain Hayes bears responsibility for the error that caused it. But you bear responsibility for trying to save him, and there is a difference between failing to save someone and causing their death. I spent 4 years conflating those two things, and I am sorry for that. Caldwell moved to stand beside the headstone, and he spoke words that had been unspoken for 4 years because accepting blame for Hayes's error had required pretending that his relationship to Captain Reeves's death was different from what it actually was. "Captain Reeves, I tried to save you. When Captain Hayes made his mistake, I pushed him aside and attempted repairs that should have worked but did not because the damage was too severe and the time was too short. I have thought about that surgery thousands of times over 4 years, wondering if there was something I missed, some technique I could have used, some different approach that would have changed the outcome." His voice remained steady, but the emotion beneath it was building. "What I have concluded is that sometimes patients die despite everything we know and everything we try, and accepting that reality is part of being a doctor. I could not save you, but I tried, and I am sorry that my trying was not enough." The group stood in silence around the grave, and Nathan moved to stand beside his father in a gesture of support that suggested the bridge between them was continuing to build, even if it was not yet complete. Laura placed her hand on her father's shoulder, and Colonel Reeves reached up to grasp it with his own hand in acknowledgement of support given and received. Finally, Colonel Reeves spoke again, his voice carrying something that sounded like resolution. "Daniel's death set in motion a series of events that led to Dr. Caldwell enlisting, serving at FOB Sentinel, saving my life and the lives of approximately 60 other soldiers, and now teaching the next generation of combat medics how to save even more lives in future conflicts. I cannot say that his death was worth that outcome, because no father wants to trade his son's life for anything. But I can say that tragedy does not have to be the end of a story. It can be the beginning of something that honors the person who was lost." They stood together for several more minutes, and then walked back through the rows of headstones to the parking area where their vehicles waited. The visit had not erased grief or guilt or the complicated emotions that came from understanding that mistakes and choices in tragedy were all woven together in ways that could not be untangled. but it had provided a form of closure that allowed forward movement instead of being trapped in cycles of blame and regret. 1 year after the attack at FOB Sentinel, Robert Caldwell stood in front of a new class of combat medics at Fort Sam Houston and delivered the same introduction he had given to previous classes, the same explanation that age was about knowledge and courage rather than years lived, the same promise that they would learn techniques that would save lives in impossible conditions. But this class was different because among the students were 3 special visitors who had requested permission to attend. Colonel Vincent Reeves sat in the back row, his recovery complete enough that he had returned to active duty as an advisor on military medical policy. Laura Reeves sat beside him, having been accepted to medical school at the University of Texas, San Antonio, and planning to specialize in trauma surgery with the goal of eventually returning to military medicine as an officer rather than enlisted medic. And in the far corner, Lieutenant Nathan Caldwell sat watching his father teach with an expression that suggested pride mixing with the ongoing process of understanding. Caldwell finished his introduction and was about to begin the technical portion of the lecture when he paused. Seeing these 3 people who represented different aspects of what had happened since he made the choice to reveal himself during a mass casualty event that had tested whether age meant limitation or advantage. Before we begin the medical content, Caldwell said to the class, "I want you to meet 3 people whose presence here demonstrates something important about service and sacrifice, and the ways that tragedy can lead to growth if we choose to learn from it rather than being destroyed by it." He gestured to Colonel Reeves. Colonel Reeves was critically wounded during the attack I described. I performed emergency surgery on him in a combat zone, then carried him 2.3 miles to reach evacuation. He survived because experience taught me how to save patients under conditions where textbook medicine fails. He is here today because he wants you to understand that the techniques you will learn in this course are not theoretical. They are the difference between soldiers living and dying. Caldwell turned to Laura. "Sergeant Reeves assisted me during that surgery despite having every reason to refuse. She is now in medical school, planning to become a trauma surgeon so she can save lives the way she helped save her father's. She is here because she wants you to understand that anyone, regardless of age or background or conventional qualifications, can become exceptional at medicine if they are willing to work hard enough and care deeply enough about the people they serve." Finally, he acknowledged Nathan. "Lieutenant Caldwell is my son. We spent 5 years barely speaking because I was better at being a surgeon than at being a father. He is here today because we are both learning that relationships can be rebuilt if both people are willing to try, that forgiveness is a process rather than an event, and that it is never too late to become the person you should have been all along." The classroom was silent, students understanding that they were witnessing something more than simple instruction about medical techniques, and Caldwell returned to his lecture understanding that teaching was not just about transferring knowledge, but about demonstrating through lived experience that the principles he taught about medicine applied equally to life. The semester continued, and Caldwell taught his students everything he had learned about trauma surgery and battlefield medicine, and the hard choices that came from having to decide who lives and who dies when resources were insufficient and time was running out. He taught them that being 68 years old meant experience rather than obsolescence, that the best medical personnel were not always the youngest, but rather the ones who had accumulated enough knowledge and wisdom to make good decisions under impossible pressure. And in the evenings when classes were finished, Caldwell would sometimes walk the grounds of Fort Sam Houston with his son, talking about topics that ranged from medicine to family to the ongoing process of rebuilding trust between people who had spent too long being strangers to each other. On one such walk, as the Texas sun was setting, Nathan asked a question that suggested he had been thinking about his father's choices and their consequences. "Dad, do you regret taking the blame for Captain Hayes 4 years ago? Knowing everything that happened afterward, would you make the same choice again?" Caldwell thought about the question seriously, understanding that his answer mattered. "I regret that my choice to protect Hayes enabled him to continue being the kind of doctor who makes mistakes and blames others. I regret that soldiers died at FOB Sentinel because Hayes was incompetent and I maintained my silence too long. I regret missing your mother's death because I was writing statements, accepting blame for errors I did not commit." He paused, watching the sunset. "But I do not regret learning what I learned about myself during those 4 years. I do not regret proving that 68 years old means experience rather than limitation. I do not regret carrying Colonel Reeves 2 miles or performing surgery that saved 60 soldiers or standing here now teaching the next generation how to save lives in impossible conditions. Nathan absorbed this. So you are saying that bad choices can lead to good outcomes if we learn from them? Caldwell shook his head slightly. I am saying that bad choices have consequences we cannot control, but we can control what we do with those consequences. We can let them destroy us, or we can use them as opportunities to become better versions of who we were. They walked in silence, and finally Nathan spoke with words that suggested the bridge between them was continuing to strengthen. I am glad you are here, Dad, teaching, being who you are supposed to be, and I am glad I am here too, learning to know the person you actually are. Caldwell felt something settle in his chest that might have been peace or hope, or the simple recognition that redemption was not a destination but a direction, not a single act but a process. They call me too old, Caldwell said quietly. The Army, the medical boards, the people who believe that 68 years means inability rather than experience. But I have learned that age is not about the number of years you have lived. It is about what you have learned during those years and whether you still have the courage to use that knowledge when it matters most. He paused. I am 68 years old, and I am teaching 40 combat medics every semester how to save lives in conditions that would challenge doctors half my age. My hands are steady, my judgment is sound. My knowledge is deeper than it has ever been because I have had 3 decades to accumulate wisdom that only time can provide. Nathan nodded, and they continued their walk through the gathering darkness while somewhere in the distance, another class of medical students studied techniques that an old man had learned over a lifetime of service. And the cycle of teaching and learning and passing knowledge from one generation to the next continued as it always had and always would, for those who understood that being useful mattered more than being recognized, that teaching mattered more than authority, and that age was not a limitation but a gift. This story hits different when you've lived long enough to be told you're too old. Dr. Caldwell's journey reminds us that society's timelines don't define our worth. Our experience does. I spent months researching this case because it challenges everything we're told about aging and capability. At 68, his hands were steadier than men half his age because wisdom doesn't come from youth. Have you ever been underestimated because of your age? How did you prove them wrong? Share your story below. I read every comment, and your experiences inspire the stories I tell next. If this resonated with you, there are more untold stories waiting. Hit subscribe so you don't miss them. What story should I cover next?